name is Jim Cunningham, and welcome to our Fair Housing Month event with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Cook County Assessor. We are, as you realize, we are in a federal building, so if you do have to go out of the building, that's why we provide coffee and some refreshments, because if you have to go out, you have to come back through security. If you need restrooms, they are immediately out from where you registered to the back on the right-hand side. So feel free to take breaks as you needed. We will have a brief break after one of the panels. So we are happy to be here today. Again, we are celebrating Fair Housing Month, and we've been working with the Cook County Assessor's Office here at HUD to figure out ways that we can bring more equity into the home buying process. So I am going to turn it over to our regional administrator, Diane Shelley, who is a former judge and my boss, and we're so happy to have her. So I'm going to turn it over to the HUD's Great Lakes Regional Administrator, Ms. Diane M. Shelley. Regional Administrator.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is really my distinct pleasure to be here today to discuss home ownership. Today is the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, the landmark law that guaranteed housing rights for all people in America. President Biden commented that the importance of this law cannot be overstated, and that we have far to go to meet its full promise. He stated that racial wealth gap is wider now than it was 55 years ago. When President Biden took office, he issued an administrative order directing all federal agencies to conduct all of their actions in a fair and equitable way in order to remedy the inequities of the past. Several days later, Secretary Fudge affirmed this directive and committed that HUD would conduct itself in a similar fashion. Everything that HUD does would be done through a lens of equity. On June 1st, 2021, the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, President Biden announced the creation of the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, commonly known as PAVE. He appointed our Secretary, Marcia Fudge, and Ambassador Susan Rice to head this task force. March 23rd marked the first anniversary since PAVE Task Force released their action plan. You will hear more about that today. Home ownership is the primary contributor to wealth building for Black and brown households, for building multi-generational wealth and housing stability. Bias in home valuation limits the ability of Black and brown families to enjoy the financial returns associated with home ownership, thereby contributing to the already large racial wealth gap. Now, we have heard stories, and we acknowledge these stories about appraisal bias. I encourage those that have not watched the documentary, Our America, Lowballed, to watch it. It's online. The film follows Black and Latino families as they fight for fair home values after lower than expected appraisals. Black and Latino families, on one hand, are undervalued when it comes to home ownership. But on the other hand, often they are overassessed when it comes to taxation. This dualism dichotomy often results in the loss of stable homes and or the inability to create wealth to pass on to the next generation. This is why we are here today. Today's discussion is intended to share information analyze the appraisal and relevant regulatory systems, discuss data, and propose solutions. We have a group of esteemed panelists who are willing to have this conversation and do a deep dive. We welcome this diverse panel. HUD's Great Lake Region, HUD's Fair Housing Department, and the Cook County Assessor's Office have brought these panelists together to discuss undervaluation and overassessment. These issues are crucial to future prosperity of underserved populations. This issue must get the attention it deserves. This is the context of our discussions here today. It is such a privilege to be with Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi, who is bringing attention to issues of equity and regressive property taxes, also a barrier to home ownership and the building of wealth. Assessor Kagi's bio is available through scanning the QR code at the bottom of the handout that you were given. At this time, I would like to turn the podium over to my colleague. I introduce you to the Cook County Assessor.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Regional Administrator Shelley, and thank you, the team from HUD. We're so excited about this event today. We've been planning it, and you, Diane, you really brought forward all the energy to push this through. We're so appreciative that we've been able to convene everyone here today. For many of us in this room, Erica Pothig needs no introduction, but let me do just that, because we're so pleased to have her here, because she brings the work that she does really brings together the topics that we'll be addressing on the panels today. Erica is the special assistant to the President of the United States for Housing and Urban Policy. She reports to Ambassador Rice at the Domestic Policy Council and has really done instrumental work on PAVE, on the assessment gap, on many other issues besides. She was the Chief Innovation Officer and Vice President for Research, for the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. She did a great work in the Obama and Biden administration on holding several positions, including Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And she was a leading architect of the White House Council for Strong Cities, Strong Communities. She also led housing policy portfolios at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and at the City of Chicago's Department of Housing. So she really brings it all together. We're really proud that she's a product of Chicago. She graduated from the University of Chicago Harris School, as well as the College of Wooster. And she also went to Kenwood Academy in the Chicago Public Schools and with me there. So we're really proud to be introducing her today to talk about these really important topics, which are so important, and we'll be digging down into it on building, first of all, getting access to our federal housing mortgage infrastructure, and for building ownership. And the appraisal gap, it's received a lot of attention appropriately as part of the PAVE work, which identifies how undervaluation when it comes to appraisals for access to mortgages reduces people's access to financing and can increase the costs of financing for becoming a homeowner. We see the same kinds of implications if you're over-assessing for taxation, because it increases the cost of ownership and also creates an additional barrier to ownership. So some of the implications of both of these gaps are the same. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Erica, and so glad to have you here, Erica. Take it away.
Thank you, Fritz, and go Broncos. And I apologize for my voice. Yesterday, as Jim Cunningham will confess, I barely had it, but I'm going to persevere through my remarks today and hopefully make it through. But thank you for that great introduction, Fritz. It is so fun to be here with you, reunited on this issue after so many years, and to be with my fellow Chicagoans today. And thank you, Director Shelley, for the invitation to join this event celebrating fair housing month. I wish I could be there with you in Chicago in person, but I'm in DC today, coming to you from the White House. It is such a rich program. I had the chance to look at it, and I was struck by the leaders you've assembled to discuss ways to address the assessment gap and property tax fairness, fair housing, and the appraisal gap. Just an incredibly rich program that I think, frankly, reflects the deep expertise and leadership in the Chicago region that's been working for decades upon decades to advance a more equitable housing market for all Chicagoans. And let us not forget that it was Dr. King's time on the southwest side of Chicago that brought light and attention to fair housing and advanced the Fair Housing Act. And this week, as Director Shelley noted, we commemorate the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. As the president did say, the importance of this law cannot be overstated. But we have a long way to go to meet its promise. Many neighborhoods across the nation remain as segregated today as they were 55 years ago. And the disparities in homeownership by race and ethnicity persist. And the racial gap, wealth gap, is wider now than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Let me say that again. The racial wealth gap is wider now than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. The Biden-Harris administration has taken action to make sure that Americans have free and fair housing choice and that homeowners can fully benefit from homeownership. In his first week in office, President Biden directed the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to fully implement the Fair Housing Act's requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. And the proposed rule was published this past January. And on June 1st, 2021, at the 100th anniversary commemorating the Tulsa Race Massacre, the president announced the creation of the Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, which is led, as Director Shelley noted, by HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge and my boss, Ambassador Susan Rice. In March, we celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the Paid Action Plan, the most wide-ranging set of actions ever announced to advance equity in the home appraisal process. Now, bias in home valuations limits the ability of Black and Brown families to enjoy the financial returns associated with homeownership, thereby contributing to the already sprawling racial wealth gap. Now, the action plan addresses the real harm. I want to just share one example that is actually in the ABC documentary that Director Shelley recommended, and I recommended too. At the White House is a release of the action plan a little bit more than a year ago. Homeowner Tanisha Tate Austin spoke about her experience with misevaluation. She actually introduced Vice President Harris as she gave her remarks. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what she said at that event. Her family's home was appraised at roughly $500,000 more than initial appraised value after having a white friend stand in for them. Let me say that again. After a white friend came and stood in for her, she got another appraisal that was $500,000 more than the first appraisal. So in her introduction of Vice President Harris at that event, Tanisha shared, and this is a quote from her, that the impact of devaluing a home in this country is powerful. It can set back a whole community. The difference we experienced in our 2 appraisals is also significant. It's the ability to pay for college. It's financial freedom. It's the foundation for generational wealth. And Tanisha said, I'm telling my family's story because I know appraisal bias is holding African Americans back from growing and supporting their families in ways we want to and deserve to. So earlier this month, the Tate Austin settled a housing discrimination lawsuit, and the U.S. Department of Justice filed a statement of interest in their case early last year. So these are just a few of the stories and examples that have brought to light these harms. Now, in the last 12 months, the PAVE task force has made critical progress toward implementing the full action plan, which is more than 20 actions and initiatives that agencies across the federal government are implementing. And by that, I mean the independent regulatory agencies, the FDIC, the OCC, the Federal Reserve Board, at FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, National Credit Union, the CFPB, as well as HUD and USDA and the Department of Justice, to name a few actions that they are taking. So these include empowering consumers with new tools and greater awareness of appraisal bias, leveraging data to identify trends and crack down on offenders of appraisal bias, and supporting a well-trained and dynamic appraiser profession. So I want to share just a few examples of what we've accomplished in the last year. First, we've empowered consumers to take action against appraisal bias. Consumers who seek to finance or refinance a home are often unaware of their options when they receive a lower than expected valuation. In January 2023, I published draft guidance to make it easier and quicker for prospective borrowers applying for a Federal Housing Administration or FHA insured loan to request what's called a reconsideration of value, or ROV, on a property if the initial valuation is lower because of suspected illegal bias. Last month, HUD awarded $54 million to 182 fair housing organizations across the country. Now, eligible activities for that funding included testing for appraisal bias, enforcement activities, and educating local communities on the issue. And earlier this year, the Federal Appraisal Subcommittee held its first ever hearing dedicated to the topic of appraisal bias. That hearing brought together federal agencies, industry experts to define the problem and discuss potential solutions. So second, we've increased transparency and the leveraging of federal data to inform policy and improve enforcement against appraisal bias. So in October 2022, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA, published, and this is the regulatory agency and the conservator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, so they play an incredibly important role in the housing market. They published the first ever publicly available data sets of aggregated statistics on appraisal records. This is leveraging something called the Uniform Appraisal Database, which provided the public with access to the data and trends found in appraisal reports. Using these data, academic researchers have already published new analyses illustrating stark differences in home evaluations across racial and ethnic groups. FHFA, along with HUD and USDA and the Veterans Administration, are working to build a federal database to share appraisal data across the federal government, because all of those agencies either guarantee the loans that they make. So they will combine their data, and the database that they will create will allow agencies to share enhanced insight that provide enhanced oversight on enforcement actions and could facilitate new research related to property valuation. Third, we're cultivating an appraiser profession that is well-trained and looks like the community it serves. I think one important fact to know that was incredibly striking to me is that 97% of the appraiser profession is white. It is one of the most non-diverse profession there is when you look at the Department of Labor statistics. The Biden-Harris administration is taking steps to remove unnecessary educational and experience requirements that make it difficult for underrepresented groups to access the profession and to strengthen anti-bias, fair housing, and fair lending training of existing appraisers. In January 2023, the Department of Veterans Affairs released new guidance to its appraiser workforce because they have their own workforce at the VA. And among other appraisers, among other steps, the guidance enhances oversight procedures to detect potential discriminatory bias in appraisal reports filed by VA B-panel appraisers and calls upon all VA B-panel appraisers and lender-approved staff to participate in appraisal bias, fair housing, and fair lending training. And last year, the appraisal subcommittee awarded a grant to the state of Mississippi to create an innovative pathway to appraiser licensure, including for appraisers from underrepresented groups and with a particular focus in underserved communities within the state where there's a shortage of appraisers. Mississippi's success has inspired several other states to express interest in replicating the program. These are just a few of the steps the administration has already taken to address appraisal bias, and there will be more actions, I'm teasing this a little bit, announced in the coming months as well. Now, as we transition to the first panel, I also want to thank Assessor Kaegi and Professor Berry for really elevating the issue of the assessment gap, as pointed out earlier. This is different than the appraisal gap. It functions differently. I think that panel will get into more detail about this, but it is related. And Dr. Berry's research really put the issue on the map, and Assessor Kagie's leadership has made it a national issue. I'm really hopeful that the administration will be able to support some new work that will test the impact of accessing some of the same data I referenced earlier that we've been using to measure the appraisal gap to address the assessment gap. So I want to close by thanking you again for inviting me to join you today. Very sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I want to close with these words from President Biden. As we celebrate the ways in which the Fair Housing Act has empowered millions of Americans with a fair shot at accessing housing opportunities over the last 55 years, let's continue to ensure everyone has free and fair housing choice, and let's join together to make the American dream a reality for all Americans. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Erica, for those great remarks and for joining us. And I'm glad your voice is better. And we really appreciate it. And we're always welcome here in Chicago.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. So as we get ready, everyone should have an agenda, and we'll close this out real quick. And if you'll notice, if you want to see the bio, there is a QR code on the bottom, and it links to the agenda as well as the biographies for all of our esteemed panelists here today. So hopefully you take advantage of that. We are going to keep moving along, and we will ask our first panel to come up, and moderated by Kelwin Harris, who is the Chief Economic Engagement Officer for the Cook County Assessor's Office. Kelwin in the panel, we invite you to the stage. I don't think we need this anymore. So I'm going to unplug and put it away.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Another special thank you to R.A. Shelley for this partnership and for the invitation here today. It's been an amazing partnership working with HUD. As Erica Pothig so eloquently stated, we're talking about a topic today that not everybody understands. Often you don't think about equity and property taxes in the same sentence, in the same vein. But unlike other social justice issues that center around Black lives and center around Black futures, property taxes has operated under the cover of sometimes big city and county politics, obscure real estate jargon, and mass appraisal modeling that's been harder for people to decode and understand. The purpose for us today is to decode it and to take the cover off and to look at what are some of the harms, what are some of the opportunities as it relates to property tax equity. So I'm going to introduce our panel briefly. The full bios are, again, on that QR code, but just to give you a general sense of who's on the panel today. Chris Berry is the William J. and Alicia Townsend Friedman Professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the college. He's the academic director of the Center of Municipal Finance and the author of Imperfect Union, Representation and Taxation in Multi-Level Governments, and the winner of the Best Book Award in Urban Politics and American Political Science. Also published in numerous journals, including the New York Times, Bloomberg, and others. Going in alphabetical order, guys. So that's the preference. It's not clout, but just the alphabet here. I see you're seated differently than I'm calling you off. Amber Henley is the director of research at the Woodstock Institute, where she leads the organization's research on financial security and equity for low and moderate income households and communities of color. Amber's worked with Roosevelt University's Policy Research Collaborative and has authored and co-authored numerous reports, including the plunder of Black wealth in Chicago, new findings on the lasting toll of predatory housing contracts, that was released at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago symposium. Alvin Horn is the City of Detroit's Deputy Financial Officer and Chief Assessor. He holds a Bachelor of Business Administration, currently in a graduate program at Siena Heights University, where he's working on a Master of Arts in Organizational Leadership. He holds several appraisal certifications and assessor certifications, Michigan Advancement Assessing Officer, Michigan Certified Personal Property Examiner, Assessment Administration Specialist, all from the IAAO, which will be a theme sort of throughout the conversation, International Association of Assessing Officers, which is the trade association, the regulatory body for the assessment industry. And then Fritz Kaegi was already introduced, but of course he's the Cook County Assessor since 2018. Prior to beginning his career in assessments in county government, he spent more than 20 years valuing assets as a mutual fund portfolio manager and analyst. He holds the Chartered Financial Analyst and Certified Certified Illinois Assessment Officer designations, also with the IAAO. Completed his undergraduate degree at Haverford College, MBA at Stanford, and he's also received numerous awards. Let's get right into the conversation. Again, as mentioned, not everybody really understands the property tax system overall. We've got some experts here. Fortunate to have two assessors in the same room on the same panel, and it's not an IAAO event, so this is a rarity. But it's a unique opportunity to kind of learn the system in two different jurisdictions, because they don't all operate the same. Actually, Cook County is very unique, and they both have consequences for equity. So I'm going to start with Fritz and ask, can you tell us a bit about the property tax system, and not give us a full, complete 101? We could be here all day. But simple snapshot, but more specifically how it relates to equity and how inequities can enter into our system here in Cook County. Don't forget the mic, Fritz. Is it on?
Cohen, can you hear me? Our assessment system here in Cook County's property tax system is basically the equity half of how property taxes are determined. So our government bodies, which is mainly for schools, determine how much money has to be raised. That's determined first. In the city of Chicago, it's a little bit more than $7.5 billion a year. In the county itself, all inclusive, it's about $17 billion. That amount is predetermined. And then we do assessments to determine each person's share of that amount of money that has to be raised each year. And it's a zero-sum system. So your share of total assessed value is your share of that $17 billion. And so it's very important as we do our work, which is estimating the value of each of those almost 2 million properties, to get it right for everyone. If you're systematically over-assessing some while under-assessing others, you are shifting burdens in a way that is going astray from each person's share of actual market value. So we always want to think about identifying biases, identifying areas where we've been inaccurate so that we can eliminate inaccuracies and undervaluation or overvaluation. So it's not just important to get valuations right for most of the people, it's important to get it right for all of them. And the key is what kind of data goes into that. And so that's the most important thing for our system here.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really important. I'm hearing terms like, zero sum. If you underassess one group, you're automatically going to overassess another group. So that's why fairness in our system is so key and critical. We'll come back to a lot of that. Alvin, can I move right over to you, sir? Could you share a little bit about how Detroit works, how it might differ from Chicago, anything that's unique about it, and how inequities might come into play in your system?
Well, thank you. Michigan is what's known as a fractional assessment state. The assessed value is supposed to represent 50% of the true cash value of the property as determined by the assessor. From that point forward, there is a different calculation for the taxable value, but it's based initially on that 50% of the value. So because the city of Detroit, particularly during the Great Recession, basically blew the assessments. When property values were plummeting, we cut values, but we didn't come deep enough. We didn't come fast enough. Those people at the low end of the economic spectrum suffered the most. The value of the property plummeted, but we still had it assessed at a number that had no reflection in the market value. It was the complete disintegration of local government and its responsibilities. Our home is the most valuable asset that most of us will ever own. When you get the assessments wrong, you destroy generational wealth. You destroy the American dream for many people because they can't get it. They can't buy into the housing market. To get back into the question, Detroit spent $3 billion trying to correct the assessed values over a 4-year period. A lot better than it was, but room for improvement. There is still regressivity at the end. It's based in a large extent because of the data or the lack of data in many cases, or in how we're interpreting it. Assessments are problematic across the board in urban areas, large urban cities, which have a high percentage of its populace who are at or close to the poverty level, who are trying to maintain older homes, and you have incomplete data sets on how to value those homes. It is a challenging prospect, one that Chicago faces, one that almost every urban area in this country faces. We do a better job than we did before, but we're not close to doing the job we need to do.
I appreciate that sober outlook, Alvin, as it relates to the conditions, in Detroit, Michigan, how they relate here to Chicago. I think there's a lot that we can learn. I'm pulling out the keywords as you guys talk. So I heard regressivity introduced by you, Alvin. I think you're sitting to your right next to a regressivity expert who's written extensively about this topic and about the Burton shift and what could happen when Burtons are shifted, when inequities do come into play in the property tax system and people aren't assessed fairly. What happens to entire groups? Chris, you've done a lot of research on this topic. If you could share with us some of your historical findings. You've looked all across the country, specifically here in Cook County. Can you talk about what you've seen historically and kind of where we are today? Because, I think when you first came out with your research, it was sort of before Fritz's administration, and now you've had some things that you've also seen since as well. So.
Great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. So I think let's just start with the big picture. These kinds of inequities in the property tax system have been with us for, I think, as long as we've had property taxes. So there's a historian at the University of Virginia, Andrew Carl, has got a book coming out soon, really showing that this began at Reconstruction, if not before. And so this is not the problem of any particular jurisdiction. It's not the fault of one assessor that's doing a bad job. There are some fundamental problems baked into the system. Mr. Horn already referred to like the data issues, and I think one of the fundamental problems that assessors face is that they don't always have complete data or good data on the homes they're trying to value. And so one of the things that's going to happen is if there's important features of homes that makes one home more expensive than another, and I as an assessor don't have the data on those features, I won't know that home number 2 is, for example, more valuable than home number 1. I'll end up valuing them as if they're the same. And that's a trend towards averaging. And there's a root problem here, which is assessing homes as if they're the average. When I don't have great data, I treat homes as if they're more similar to each other than they are. And so I didn't know that home number 2 was more expensive. I assess it lower. I didn't know that home number 1 was less expensive. I've assessed it too high. And sort of when every home is being treated as an average, we're by definition going to have regressivity, because the more expensive home is treated as if it's average, the less expensive home is treated as if it's average. And all the statistics.
And that's the regressivity.
That's the regressivity. All the things that we do statistically are just fancier versions of averaging, and we could come, that's probably beyond what we want to get into today. But yeah, and so the starting point is I observe these problems everywhere. This wasn't a uniquely Cook County problem. It was not a uniquely Detroit problem. You see these in 90% of the jurisdictions in the country, some form of regressivity. So I do want to start by saying we shouldn't be focusing on what was wrong in this one system per se, so much as what's baked into the whole enterprise from the get-go. However, I am really encouraged by what I've seen in Cook County recently, because it does suggest that while these problems are very pervasive, they can also be addressed and remedied, by using better data and better models, which is essentially what's happened here in Cook County under Assessor Kagi's leadership. And based on the initial results that I'm seeing, and I haven't finished my study, because of the triennial nature of how we reassess, it takes a while for the full reassessment, and this has really just kind of happened in terms of complete data that's gone through the appeals process only very recently. But initially, what I'm seeing is dramatic improvement. So I think both, on the one hand, we have to say it's a very widespread problem that we see in many jurisdictions. At the same time, we're seeing that jurisdictions that are committed to trying to fix this problem and willing to invest in people and resources, as to say data and better models, can go a long way towards fixing the problems. We could talk in more detail about what's involved in that, but the high level answer is this is a widespread problem that you see virtually everywhere, because there are just these fundamental issues of data, and that forces a kind of averaging that bakes in regressivity, but it can be fixed.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we're all here, to talk about fixing the problem. In our preps, one main theme that came forward was that nobody has all the answers. No one jurisdiction, no one scholar is getting it 100% right, but that we're all swimming in the same direction. Amber, one of the reasons that I wanted you to be here, you've done some great research with the Woodstock Institute, particularly around homeownership, why homeownership matters. Sort of taking this conversation from the esoteric rubric of assessments to bringing it home to everyday people. Why it matters to the lives of communities of color as it relates to their ability to afford a home, stay in a home. Why are property taxes important?
So I've been watching a lot of Ted Lasso lately, so I'm going to channel him when he's like talking about football, but he's really talking about real life. And everyone's talking about the tax assessment system, but it's connected to real life. And I'll focus on income and property values and how that connects to people and outcomes. And so the research that he's speaking of is we're talking about closing the racial wealth gap. So what I'm going to talk about also is specific to actually closing the racial wealth gap, not just allowing Black folk or LMI people access to more wealth, like closing the racial wealth gap. And so when we think about income and property value, they're tied to everything that tax assessment, property taxes are meant to pay for, right? Schools, that's related to the income and the ability to get a quality education. Property values, what type of schools are there, right? That's paid for in property taxes. Street maintenance, the metro stations that the property taxes are actually supposed to fund are inputs for income and property value inequality, or equality once we get there, right? Because right now they're inputs for income inequality. So when we speak specifically to the Black population, we looked at 2021 Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, HMDA data, for Black, non-Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic applicants. And we saw that the median income for the Black households was $78,000 to the $131,000 for a white household. Okay, so again, income is important, and the inputs for property taxes, like what property taxes fund are the inputs to the outcomes for these things. So then we also looked at what were the property values associated with these applicants, or actually the borrowers, right? So that's just what the incomes were for the applicants. But when we looked out to the actual borrowers, those who had loans originated, we found that the property value, the median property value, was $255 for a Black household to $445 for a white household, okay? And that's important because another panel will talk about appraisal bias. That's one part of the story. The other part is unequal landscapes related to ways that money is invested, public and private, right? But we're going to speak specific to the public that comes from these tax assessments. There are unequal landscapes that will have these properties valued differently, even if we remove appraisal bias, because the inputs are not equitable, right? And so when we talk about wealth, that system is equalizing. It's not equity. There's no equity built into it. It's equalizing. So if you start at this value and you start at this value and you appreciate at the same rate, that's equality, right? But that's not going to get to closing the racial wealth gap. So that's just one part of the story. The other part is when we're talking about specifically the overassessments and how amazing Chicago or Cook County has done with trying to get things back to or not back to, because they never were, but to a place where it is more fair. That is wonderful for the generation that has not come yet, because when they come into a system that doesn't have these barriers and they get to start out in equal playing fields, they get to have fair outcomes. But what about the North Lawndalians, because that's the community that I worked in for 2 years? What about them who were over-assessed for so many years and now it's fair, but what about the extraction that happened that is directly correlated with some vacant lots? Because if you maintain your property, right, you are at this differential income level, right? So if you have 30% of your income goes to housing, that leaves $55K left for the rest of the year before taxes to pay for everything you need to pay for, versus the 92 that a white household has, right? So we have different things to pay for the same basic needs. But these homes are older in these communities, right? Don't they need maintenance? Don't they need to be taken care of? But when you're paying more and you've been doing this for, like, I love that it's fixed now, but what about the fact that we still see the remnants and families actually still feel like that loss that they're still trying to catch up from? We also do work on predatory loans, right? Because you have to pay those. You want to keep your home. Homeownership means so much to Black households because we've been told that that is the American dream and that is how we build generational wealth. That is the narrative. But that has not been the case, actually. But we hold tight to that. So we do what we can to hold on to that house, to pay that. We got to pay that overassessed value from last generation, so on and so forth. But then we don't have the money to invest in maintaining our homes. Our homes are deteriorating. Now we have all of the vacant lots. So it's all connected. And so that also has to be accounted for. Is like, there is the wealth piece, but now I'm talking about like the dignity piece that is still connected to being able to reinvest, and your properties are not going to be able to appreciate like everybody else's because the inputs are not there. The money's not going there, for one. But also, you are not able to invest in the integrity of your infrastructure because for generations, you have had higher bills. You have been robbing Peter to pay Paul, using predatory lending, because that is where predatory lending is, in those same community areas that were overassessed. And I will leave it there because I've probably said too much.
Yep. No, I'm hearing some snaps and some claps out there. So, but yeah, and again, Amber, I wanted that perspective because people need to realize, I think that the stakes are really high, and the work that we're doing in the Cook County Assessor's Office, the work that Alvin's doing in Detroit and that Chris is doing through his research have the ability to affect and to correct historical harms that are already baked into the system. And if we don't get it right, the reverse will be true. We'll continue to follow those old fault lines of, redlining and contract buying and the system that's already in place. So thank you for that context. Fritz, let's go back to you, and really for the entire panel. Just want to open it up. We've kind of laid the groundwork, talked about, how the systems of assessment work in Cook County and in Michigan, got some research, historical perspective. where do we go from here? How do you talk about, reforming the system? How do you talk about systemic change in this context? And of course, the thread throughout the day are solutions. R.A. Shelley did not want this to be a conversation, and Fritz about, lament. Of course, we have to create the context, but let's talk about how do we move forward and how do we find solutions to these problems. What is it like in Cook County, Fritz, and what are some of your proposals? You've said a lot over the course of the past 4 years.
Well, in the spirit of Dr. Shelley's, and my mutual desire to focus on solutions, I think the framework that Professor Berry had for identifying where the problems are in regressivity is a good one, because he basically broke it down into two different problems. He says part of the problem with regressivity in assessments has to do with poor modeling, that modeling is building in averages of things that should not be averaged. And there are modeling approaches that can eliminate this averaging. Just to make it very real for Chicagoans here, Woodlawn is next to Hyde Park, but they should not be averaged. If you average Woodlawn and Hyde Park, you're averaging a lower income neighborhood with lower housing values, with higher housing values, higher income neighborhood. You average the two, you end up over assessing Woodlawn, under assessing Hyde Park. You can solve for that with better modeling. And the progress that Professor Berry was talking about and Amber was talking about, we think we've done it through better modeling. But there's a second problem that still exists, that Alvin faces, that I face, that assessors across the nation face, and that Professor Berry has identified, and that's that qualitative and descriptive information about homes, especially their condition and what's going on inside, is information we typically don't have. And when we don't have that, you can end up over assessing neighborhoods that have had less wealth, that don't have the same resources to put into upkeep or renovation of the home. And let's just make it very real for what that means in Chicago and Cook County. You could easily be over assessing a home by $30,000 if you don't have information about its condition. The difference between an average and a below average home when it comes to condition and quality, it's $30,000. That's easily what you could put into renovating a kitchen, your bathrooms, something else. $30,000 difference in a system where the average effective tax rate is 2% or more, that's $600 on your tax bill every year. A good rule of thumb for the impact on housing value is that annual difference, multiply that by 10 or 15 to know the impact on the housing price. So you're looking at over a $10,000 impact on people's housing price. And remember that when people buy a home, they're leveraging it with a mortgage. So you might only have a typical home buyer who's putting 20% equity into a new home. They might have equity of $30,000. So if you're talking about a swing of something that affects $10,000 on your home equity, that is huge for wealth generation. So the solution is that our federal mortgage system has a database of appraisals. For every mortgage that the government is guaranteeing, there is an appraisal that comes with it, and it goes into a national database. And this is what Erica Pothig was mentioning, that it's called the UAD, the Uniform Appraisal Database, and that appraisal that you submit with your mortgage goes into this national database, and there's extensive information about condition and quality in homes. So the data exists to solve this problem, which affects tens of millions of homes across America. And so when I was telling Professor Berry about the existence of this database, he said, you need to talk to Erica Pothig at the White House to try to bring this attention to them. And she came back to me and she said, Fritz, get a letter from the top assessors in the country asking for access to this database, and we'll try to work on it, because the government owns the database. And so Alvin, as well as 15 of the other largest assessors in America, a bipartisan group, Maricopa County in Arizona, Miami, Dallas, LA, Philly, Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, we wrote a letter to ask access for this data. And so this is the way to really address this issue, because you can affect tens of millions of problems to eliminate regressivity in this second way that still exists.
That's great, Fritz. I know you've been working with Alvin on that letter as well to the White House and other jurisdictions. So thank you for that. Alvin, solutions. What do you think best practices that either you're implementing currently or you think could help move us forward?
Well, I think the way to answer the solution is to admit there's a problem. And in a lot of
Okay.
cases, people don't want to admit there's a problem, or they don't want to admit how deep and how wide the problem is. It's data, but it's also interpreting the data correctly. In Detroit, most of the transfers are quick claim deeds or land contracts. Those aren't market sales. Those are literally, here's the house, take it or leave it. That contributes to the inequity, because you have the data you have. If all I have are quick claim deeds, if all I have are land contracts, if all I have are houses which are 90 plus years old, and people who do not have the means to maintain them, that's the picture that we have to somehow figure out how to fairly value those properties. So it's data, but it's also resources. Because in a place like Detroit, when the data is limited, and where it may not paint a fair or accurate picture, it takes resources. It takes better modeling. It also takes highly trained people who actually know what they're looking for. In Detroit, we spend more time in the field looking at the lower value properties than we would like to be honest with you. We have to, because we don't have the data on those properties. But that's an inefficient way of valuing properties. Sending people up and down the streets to try to determine the difference between one neighborhood and the next. That's inefficient, but it's what we have. So as Fritz pointed out, it's the data, getting better data, but it's also interpreting that data correctly, understanding the difference between the neighborhoods. The professor spoke about averaging. That's the reality of the assessing practice. Unfortunately, it is all statistics. You take a range of properties, you try to remove the outliers and average the rest of them. Michigan uses something called economic condition factors. You're supposed to put everything in a neighborhood that is similar. In theory, that would reduce the averaging. But the reality is those ECFs, those economic neighborhoods, are based on data. And if the data is faulty to begin with, then the results are going to be faulty. So it's about better data, but it's also about having trained people who can understand and interpret the data and understand the neighborhoods and the conditions of those jurisdictions. All valuation is local. You need people who understand the living conditions and the neighborhoods to accurately value those properties.
Fritz, back to you actually quickly, because we can learn from each other here. Can you talk a little bit about how we currently get data and access data in the Cook County Assessor's Office? What's our process?
Sure. So what data do we base our valuations on? So we have information about sales, which is pretty good. So we can look at the sales that happen in neighborhoods across Cook County, and that's a very important building block. But then we also need to do a physical census of what's out there. We get building permits that come into our office. We have the historical accumulation of all the building permits that have been given to our office for the last couple decades. We could talk about how good some of that data is. If you could imagine, and all the things that Chicago and Cook County has seen since before World War II, you could imagine that some of the data might not have been fully captured through all the different steps, because you have 132 different municipalities hopefully catching building permit in activity in the permits. The permits aren't necessarily the most accurate reflection of what's actually happening. Those very different permits get submitted to an assessor's office that just until a couple of years ago had a 40-year-old computer system that had been installed when Blues Brothers was in the theater still. And so the computer system didn't necessarily have the capacity to capture all that information that's coming in, and you had humans who'd be entering that information and maybe not all of that. So you go from the reality, which is very rich, very different, all the variety in God's kingdom here in Cook County, but it's imperfectly reflected in that data that comes into homes. And then, of course, every neighborhood and market's different. So what we do is our models look at, okay, we have these sales, we have this variety of different homes and conditions. We have a staff that goes out and visits neighborhoods and sees what's out there, but they are, this is fewer than 50 people trying to visit 2 million properties. The scale is enormous. There's a lot you're going to miss. We think you can get a lot of the way to having a fair system by taking these sales and doing really good modeling that doesn't average when you're not supposed to be averaging. Computational power is getting cheaper and cheaper. So there's some pretty sophisticated things you could do that look at location so that you're not averaging what might have been averaged in the past. But if the data that's coming into it is not good, is not accurate, you're going to come up with problems. Like one neighborhood that we focus in on is Pilsen in Chicago, which is a neighborhood that's largely Latino. It's near the center of Chicago. It's experienced a lot of gentrification. It actually had the greatest increase in real estate prices of any neighborhood in Chicago over the last couple of years. It has a pretty old housing stock. Some homes are over 120 years old, but it's also had a lot of new renovation. And when you have sales, you have to look really carefully at what has been renovated and flipped and what has not. And you don't generally want to project from the flipped homes to the ones that have not been renovated. And that can be very tricky if your data is not good. Imagine we're seeing a sale of a home that we thought had 2,000 square feet, but actually had 3,000 because they'd renovated, but it was not reflected in a permit. We would have counted that sale as a much higher sales per square foot than actually happened. And that could screw up the model. And then we might be projecting that onto other homes where we also don't have rich enough data. And that's how the system can go awry. And that's why it needs
helpful.
Fixing.
That's helpful. The Blues Brothers is a common theme in our office, so forgive us for that. We won't quit. We won't quit. Chris, can you talk a little bit about recommendations, or even as you looked across the country, best practices and things that you've seen that these two assessors can implement?
Sure, I do think it's important to set a little context, and for the audience in particular to appreciate the assessors we have before us now, because I would say the first step is to acknowledge there's a problem. It's already pretty unusual that we have two prominent assessors who are just willing to say there's a problem publicly. That is not, unfortunately, not very common. And so I think if you want to think about how to fix the system, different jurisdictions are in different places in terms of their ability to take this on. The first step is to acknowledge there's a problem. That's, as I said, quite rare. So to be concrete, every jurisdiction needs to be doing regularly something called a sales ratio study, which we don't need to worry about the details, but basically that's an internal audit of the fairness of the assessments. Every assessor has the data that's required to do that. The International Association of Assessing Officers has very clear standards for how it's done. And yet I am consistently shocked at how few jurisdictions are doing and then publishing such studies. So I work all around the country, and whenever I'm engaging with a new jurisdiction, someone contacts me about some unfairness in their jurisdiction, the first thing I want to do is, well, let's go look at the ratio study. The assessor should have those. When the assessor doesn't have a ratio study available on their site, I know this is not going to be a good situation, okay? And that's just all too common. So I would say as a starting point, every jurisdiction should be doing these studies. They should be releasing them publicly. And there is a role for higher level governments, whether that's the state or the federal government, to require that this is done. So as terms of a baby step that every jurisdiction should be doing, they are responsible and really should be releasing these studies. Getting beyond that, concretely, what can be done? I think both assessors have already highlighted some things, but everybody in this room probably knows the adage of real estate: location, location, location. And so, if the assessor isn't getting these locational factors right, it's unlikely they're going to have good assessments. And yet, we see, Assessor Kagi already mentioned the example of like Hyde Park and Woodlawn being different markets that are adjacent to one another. It's very common to see that assessors are just not getting the locations very well modeled where they they are, and that, the variation in local prices is not well reflected. And you can see that as an assessor in the fact that when you look at the errors, which you should always be doing, is looking at the errors in your models when they're spatially concentrated. In other words, here's a whole pocket of people who are underassessed, a whole pocket of people who are overassessed. That kind of spatial clustering of mistakes is telling you that you haven't gotten the locations modeled well. We are at a point now technologically with advances in machine learning, which advances in GIS and spatial analysis, that's a very fixable problem. There's no reason we should not be understanding local real estate market variation, and yet I see that so commonly from place to place. So in terms of like a low-hanging fruit that almost any jurisdiction should be able to fix, get the location right, use more advanced modeling. This is a fixable problem. Getting the data, so that's like on the modeling side. Getting the data right can be more challenging, and I'm pleased that Assessor Horn, Assessor Kagi are signing on to this initiative to get better data from the federal government, which we hope they will release it, and that will add a new field, a new information about quality of the properties. But so better modeling, better data. I think, and Assessor Horn already alluded to, this may mean also getting in better people, better modelers. For better or worse, the assessing community hasn't always been on the most cutting edge of statistical methods. And so oftentimes having people who are recently trained on things like machine learning can be really valuable. I was very pleased to see the CCAO, the Cook County Assessor's Office, hire some well-trained people coming out of University of Chicago, some former students of mine in a couple cases, to come in and really try to make this happen. So often better data, better models, and better personnel can really help. I don't want to end this without at least acknowledging that some of these inequities are due to actual policy choices that we can change. And just to give a couple examples, in New York City and many jurisdictions, but I'll focus on New York where I've done research, there are assessment caps. Okay, these are limits in how much assessments can increase year over year. These are often very well-meaning in their original creation, which is, well, we want to protect people from large, unexpected increases in property taxes. What their effects are over time, however, is to increase regressivity by benefiting the neighborhoods that are growing fastest. So in New York, for example, Brooklyn, as that market has really skyrocketed, has benefited tremendously from these assessments caps that say you have values that are going up 15, 20% a year. Assessments can only go up 5% a year. That's going to increase regressivity because what are becoming the most expensive parts of the city are having their assessments held down, whereas the parts of the city that are going slower, their assessments are fully catching up to their true values. That increases regressivity. That's a policy choice. That's not about data. That's not about modeling. That is, we made a choice to put limits on assessments without any reference to the value of the property. In other words, these limits benefit even the most expensive homes. So we could change that. Here in Cook County, we are very generous in appeals at the Board of Review. And that's going to increase regressivity. We know that who appeals. So under the old assessor, under Barrios, when confronted with, hey, these assessments are regressive, his immediate reaction was, hey, that's no problem. If your taxes are too high, just appeal. Well, you know what? It turns out that who appeals are the people with the most to gain from appealing, which are the people with the most expensive homes. And the Board of Review has historically been far too generous in granting those appeals. And that increases regressivity in the system. That's a choice. Okay, that's not about data or models. That's about we made a choice to give reductions to people at the top who are least in need of them and least likely to have been overassessed in the first place. So we got to have better data and better models. We also have some choices that we're making, that we could just put an end to.
All right, take a breath after that. That was that was a lot, Chris, but no, really powerhouse stuff. You mentioned appeals in the Board of Review. That was going to be one of my questions. I mean, certainly that's an area probably for another panel, but one that is really significant for equity. I mean, the final stop in Cook County is not the assessor's office, but it's actually the Board of Review that can change a lot of our values. So definitely relevant to the conversation. And who gets to appeal, right? So just really appreciate that. We are streaming today, so other assessors are watching this throughout the country. So they'll be polishing their sales ratio studies when they hear Chris calling now from that advice. So let's move back to Amber. Thoughts, recommendations these fellows should be thinking about.
So piggybacking off of each of these gentlemen, but also adding some nuances. I also request for data reporting, but of a different sort.
Okay.
So as a mechanism to check and see if things are fair, producing a report annually that says how much was assessed by community area or municipality to see, comparing AMI and property values, right? And allowing public to respond and to make comments to talk about, well, this seems right or this seems wrong. They can, so letting people have a little bit more say in that by presenting this, and then actually going back, because we do understand under Fritz Kaegi, I'm very excited. I was very excited when I found out a few years ago at Aon when you announced how you were taxing them appropriately, that it seems like we are trying to right the ship. But I cannot stress that damage was done, not under his administration, but it was done, and it still needs to be taken care of and addressed. It's not, we can't move forward. We've lost Black population every year because of this and things like this. Like every year Black population is declining. And we're just like, okay, I mean, that's a choice that they're making. But it's really not when you think about things like this. So what are we doing to address that? But going back again to show when was this overassessed and when wasn't it? So we can understand those metrics, but also how were the taxes allocated in that community area or that municipality? How much was assessed, but how much was put back and where was it put back? That's not all on the assessor, obviously, right? But it's a part of the process. So we're talking about assessment. So we should be talking about things that are also connected to this that paint the larger picture. And then to say that caps and appeals are not necessarily bad if they're not like thoughtful, right? And if we have this data to say, well, this community area for 10 years was over assessed. So I can look at appeals here, but this community area was so on and so forth. There's ways to put policy to make it more thoughtful and to protect and to make sure that it is for those that are vulnerable, who have every right to appeal and who should, and make that process easier for them. But if we take that data, how much was taken from this community area, this Cook County municipality, how much was put back in to schools, infrastructure, police department, so on and so forth. What is the median property value? All of these things make that publicly accessible, going back as far as we possibly can. And I'm glad that Dr. Berry said this, is right now in this age of data science and R and Python, all of this stuff can be done. You can take this raw data. It's actually not a heavy lift. It's not a heavy lift to do that, to clean the data in that way. We have to have it. We don't have to make it up, right? Because we spent this money, we collected this money. So again, I would say to the appeals and those rate caps, they're not bad if they're well-intentioned. But not just well-intentioned, it's codified correctly. But we can do that showing the historical harms that were done by this particular system.
Yeah. Appreciate that. And I'm sure all these, gentlemen and assessors across the country have thoughts on, a lot of your recommendations, but it's so important as it relates to investment in community and really thinking outside of the box and almost, looking for radical solutions to radical harm. So I want to open it up for questions. Are there questions in the audience for the assessors or our research experts? Yes, sir. You were first and strongly had your hand up first. We want to get you a microphone though. So Jim is coming with a mic.
Thank you. Hassan, great. Thank you so much for your presentations. Greatly appreciate all this really fascinating information and the wonderful perspectives that you are sharing. My question is about mostly sort of collecting data and trying to establish a narrative around it. So there's lots of sort of issues that cross the geospatial relationships that people have to place. My question specifically is, what advantages might one see in engaging community groups in regards to property value taxation? Like, they know what they pay for taxes, they know what they pay for homes, they know what's going on in their community, and in their communities and across their communities adjacencies. So the Hyde Park Woodlawn issue that was spoken about might be something that could be addressed in a way that is a lot simpler and engenders building trust with community. So what kind of opportunities have the panelists seen in the area of engaging people engaging people on like the prices they're paying and community groups. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's vital to engage community groups, but also think you have to be very careful. It tends to be the better organized, the wealthier neighborhoods which have community groups. It gets us back to the problem we're addressing now. The neighborhoods and the communities at the lower end of the spectrum usually aren't that well organized. So it's a great thing. It's a vital thing to engage community groups. We do a far better job in Detroit than we have in the past, but we can certainly do better. But you have to recognize that those neighborhoods, which are organized, which are prepared to come to the assessor, go to the board review, speak before the mayor and the city council, those are the neighborhoods generally at the top of the economic scale. It still leaves out those people who are most harmed by the issues that we're talking about today. So it's vital to do it, but you have to understand their limitations in dealing with community groups. They don't always address the very people you're trying to help.
What I'd add is that the property tax system is so confusing that it's sometimes hard for community groups to figure out where they can have the most leverage over systemic change. Oftentimes, people's frustration, it's coming down to, you have bad data about my house, or you over-assessed me, and my bill's too high. And that's something that we can solve. But, Professor Barry and Amber, they were talking about choices that have been made and larger solutions to harms that have already been done. And I think this is actually where communities can have the greatest impact, because, even if we got assessments 100% perfect, there would still be an outrageous inequity in terms of communities and what burdens they have to bear to educate our children. Most property taxes are for educating our children, the future generation. It's about 2/3 in Cook County. Harvey, which is a community in the south suburbs, pays a rate that is 6 times the rate in Chicago. 6 times. For someone who owns a $100,000 home, you have to pay 6 times the rate to own that home in Harvey, just so their kid can be educated with the same resources in Chicago. That is outrageous. So it's a choice that's made by our state. Our state provides less support for school districts than any state in the union, and that is why our property taxes are high. Our school districts only have one tool to cover their resources. Only 25% comes from the state. In most states, it's closer to 50%. I bet in Michigan it's a lot closer. And so our school districts make up the gap by taxing property, which is fine, except if you're in a community like Harvey that's been impacted by deindustrialization and the collapse of the housing market, more than 10 years ago. And that's a choice that's made by our state. And so I always try to say that, look, as the assessor, I have my tool with assessments, which can make sure that everyone's valued fairly and can shift burdens, but I can't change the overall burden. But we can change the overall burden through our communities mobilizing to say the state needs to be covering more of the cost of educating our children, so we don't have this big disparity between Harvey and Chicago. The good people of Harvey did nothing to deserve this, right? And it happened. That disparity was not as big as it, 10, 20, 30 years ago as it is now. So that's something that communities really can make a big difference on.
Yeah, it's almost, burden shifting rather than burden reducing. How do we look for ways to reduce that burden? So
in terms of, at a very practical level, this one point I'd like to make in terms of engaging communities is often it's the case that people don't really understand whether they've been taxed fairly or not. And it's because the system is so complex that you cannot know from looking at only your own tax bill whether you've been taxed fairly. This is a really important thing for every homeowner to understand. Well, it's not enough to know how your home has been assessed. You also have to know how everyone else's home has been assessed. And just to give an example, Assessor Horn mentioned that Michigan is a fractional assessment state at 50%. Here in Cook County, the target is 10%. But suppose, you suppose your home's worth $200,000, you get your tax bill and you're assessed at $200,000. Maybe you're even assessed at $190,000. You might think, hey, that's pretty good. I'm being assessed fairly. What you don't see is the home that's worth $1 million that was assessed at $650,000. Okay. And because when one person is underassessed, everyone else ends up paying their taxes effectively. If you only see your own bill, even if that's accurate, what you have to know is, well, was I assessed proportionally more than everybody else? And one of the tricks that was done by the predecessor to Assessor Kagi was to underassess everybody a little bit, but underassess the people at the top by a lot. And so if you're at the bottom, you got a $100,000 home, you get your assessment in the mail, and they said it was only worth 80, and you think, I've gotten a good deal. I'm not going to say anything. This is good for me. But you didn't know, so you were assessed at 80% what your home was worth. You didn't know the person at the top was assessed at 60% what their home was worth. Okay. And so in terms of engaging community groups, often, the community isn't aware of whether they've been treated fairly or not, because they're not in a position to do this kind of analysis. And so, shameless plug, I do have a website that tries to produce this kind of work in most jurisdictions around the country. And you can go and pull up a map, and the map will show you within a jurisdiction, you word it down to the census tract, what are the neighborhoods that are being over and undervalued? Because that's just not a thing that most homeowners can do. And I have found that it's a good way to engage with the community just by presenting these facts, like, hey, your census tract, your neighborhood is being overassessed systematically. You might not know it from only looking at your own bill.
All right.
If I may.
Okay.
The good
You guys,
professor-
I would also ask you to kind of consider this your closing comments as well. You engaged in this question so well that
I'm sorry.
questions are over. So go ahead and make this your final wrap.
I will.
And but great discussion. So yes, Alvin, please continue.
The professor mentioned sales ratio studies. They're a great tool, but in a lot of jurisdictions, we don't have the right tools. Michigan requires you to follow every jurisdiction to file a sales ratio study, but it's by class of property. Every class has to be at 50%. That disguises the real problem. Every year, the city of Detroit's at 50%. Residential's at 50, commercial's at 50, personal properties at 50, industrial's at 50. If you just look at that study, everything's fine. It's when you dig deep into the weeds, you realize, just as Fritz said, and just like the good professor said, lower end neighborhoods are paying more in taxes against the value of that property than higher end neighborhoods. So a lot of it is the tools that we have to use, and it goes back to educating our staffs and making sure that our political masters understand that to fix this problem, we need the resources to do it. So I look forward to, Fritz has been a great friend, and a lot of the work that he's done in Chicago has really led the way in the assessment community, and I congratulate him on that. My introduction to Professor Berry several years ago was a little rougher, but
Thanks for breaking that ice, Alvin. The prep was so hard for this
Yes.
panel.
but in the long run, it served a valuable purpose in Detroit. He shook the cages, he broke the windows, he said, "Hey, you guys are really screwing up." He said out loud what everybody already knew, and because it was said in public, finally, we had to react to it. So I thank the good professor for his work several years ago. It helped me develop some thick skin, I should say. And I appreciate being part of this
Appreciate
panel.
you. Thank you. Any other closing comments? Or okay, let's give Amber the final word.
Yes, so just again, a call for transparency and where the money is going, how much is coming from community, because I know in Chicago, there are organized homeowners associations, and not the kind that care about the landscaping. North Lawndale, they meet once a month and they have committees, and they're trying to understand, like, they work hard, they have full-time jobs, and then they have, like, this is also a job for them. They're trying to do what hasn't been done for their communities. You have Rage in Inglewood. They're organized all over the city of Chicago. It's
Right.
the information, the transparency is not there. So again, it's just a call for, let's know what is being taken, right? What is being charged to the communities, and what is being put back in, because that is an important part of the conversation if we're talking about fair, because the question was, how do we make this fair?
Mhm.
And so that means we need to look at, again, we need this going back historically to track that. we were overassessed, so more was taken. Well, how much was being put back in versus today? And giving that information to these organized community groups and community members, because they are, and they're educated and they know, but they don't have full information. That's the reality, is we don't have full information. The advocates, the researchers, we're also trying to help, but there's not full information. And with that information, all it takes is how much was charged, how much was put back into that community. When you give that information to the community members, they'll help make the system fair. They'll give you great ideas about how to make this fair for everyone.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we understand that we're all connected here in property taxes. It's a zero-sum game. I like ending on the theme of engagement out the door. Well, not out the door. You got more panels left, but continuing this conversation around property taxes and equity and education, getting more data. We're working with the White House, working with the federal government. Again, thank you for the partnership here with HUD. It's an amazing way to kickstart that conversation and then passing that data on to the community for people that can understand it, digest it, and use it. Thank you, guys. Thanks this panel. Give them a hand, please. Thank everybody for joining us. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a property taxpayer in Cook County, I learned some things today, so that's very, very helpful. And we will also have some time for, I think at the end of all the panels, if you have some, I know there's some questions we didn't get to, so we will hopefully have some time as long as we can keep on track. Again, thank you for this panel. Now we're going to talk for one of the main reasons we're here for several reasons, but it is Fair Housing Month. So we're going to have our panel on fair housing, led by our Regional Fair Housing Director, Lon Meltison, and they should be joining us shortly. So we'll go make sure they're on their way. And we will take a quick break after this panel. Okay, we are back and with our next panel again, led by Lon Meltison, our Regional Fair Housing Director for the Chicago Regional Office, and let him turn it over. Here you go, Lon.
All right, thank you so much, Jim. Good morning, everyone. As Jim said, my name is Lon Meltison, and I'm the Regional Director for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity here in Region 5.
That was such a wonderful panel. Thank you again for the panelists that participated. But now we have another exciting panel. This is, just so much information.
Thank you so much, Regional Administrator Shelley. As everyone is aware, April is Fair Housing Month. And so this April, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the landmark civil rights legislation that was promoted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on April 11th, 1968, which made discrimination in housing unlawful. 55 years later, the Fair Housing Act is still a very powerful tool in ensuring justice and dignity throughout our entire housing system. It guarantees for all citizens the right to choose housing of their choice, regardless of their race, their color, their national origin, their religion, their sex, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity, familiar status, and disability. However, as you heard throughout this morning, despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the home ownership gap between Black and brown Americans and white Americans is greater now than it was 55 years ago. And so for this panel, we want to discuss how discrimination is continuing to act as a barrier to home ownership. So we put together today a group of fair housing experts from the fair housing community. And I just want to take a second to introduce them, and then I'll turn it over to them to kind of talk a little bit about their organizations. So we have with us here today, Demetria McCain, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Demetria has come all the way from Washington, D.C. to be here today, so we really appreciate her being here in person. Along with Demetria, we have Athena Williams, who is the Executive Director of the Oak Park Regional Housing Council. And we have Amy Nelson, who is a Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center for Central Indiana. So Amy has come all the way from our sister state over in Indiana. And then last but not least, we have Professor Michael Tsang from the University of Illinois School of Law, which you may remember them as being formerly the John Marshall Law School. So with that, what I would like to do is to kind of start off our discussion here today with giving our esteemed panelists an opportunity to introduce not just themselves, but the organizations that they work for and the work that they do. So with that, Demetria, can you get us rolling and tell us a little bit about yourself and your office and the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity?
Well, I don't know if I want to talk about myself too much, but I am indeed, I've been a year and a half now at HUD as an appointee. So I have the pleasure of leading over 500 staff persons across our 10 regions who work for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. So I'm thrilled to do that. And if you are part of the family, please raise your hand if you're here, please. This is our family. This is our FHEO family. So thank you very much. And so in our office, we do both enforcement work, compliance work, program work. We provide support and grants for our fair housing partners, our FIPS, our Fair Housing Initiatives Program. We also partner with our FAPS, our Fair Housing Assistance Programs, which are city and state governmental entities who have their own fair housing laws that are substantially similar to the federal fair housing law, which Lon mentioned is now 55 years old. And so that's some of the work we'll do, and I'll pass the microphone over.
Thank you, Demetria.
Again, my name is Athena Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of Oak Park Regional Housing Center. Oak Park Regional Housing Center, as the name states, is based in Oak Park. However, we service all the communities that surround Oak Park. Oak Park Regional Housing Center is 50 years old. Well, we celebrated 50 years last year, but we're in our 51st year, and we have our foundation with a strong goal of affordably furthering fair housing, helping individuals to realize that they can live anywhere they choose. And that's been the work of Oak Park Regional Housing Center for the last 50 years. We provide rental services, homeownership services, and financial education services, and everything else that falls under that community development dynamic.
Okay, I'm Michael Tsang. I'm with the UIC Law School, and we have a fair housing center that we established in 1991 that primarily does education and outreach. We do fair housing trainings. We have conferences, retreats periodically, where we look at housing discrimination issues. In 1993, we established a clinic at the law school where we do enforcement work. And I would say that the thing that I'm the most proud about what we do is we're really training a new generation of law students to recognize fair housing issues and to know how to litigate and enforce the fair housing laws. About 10 years ago, thanks to HUD, and I might mention that from 1991, we've been pretty much almost continuously the recipients of HUD FIP funding, which we greatly appreciate. But I've been teaching a course to undergraduate and graduate students who are not law students. And again, preparing them to go out into the areas of urban planning, into architecture, all diverse areas with an understanding about the fair housing laws and their importance in our society and how they should be enforced. So the thing I'm most proud of, I think, is the students that we've put out over the last 30 years, and particularly the non-law students in the last 10 years who are knowledgeable about fair housing law.
Amy Nelson with the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, and I need to say it's Fair Housing Month, and I'm wearing my Fair Housing message this month on it. So I just want to point that out why I'm in a sweatshirt. It's work-related sweatshirt. So the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana works to ensure equal housing opportunities for all. We are based in Indianapolis. We serve a 24 technical county area in Central Indiana, but we're the only such organization in the state of Indiana. So sometimes we do venture outside of that. As far as the work that we're most proud of is it's really our enforcement related work and of course our education and outreach. On the enforcement side, our organization has been particularly active in challenging redlining, modern day redlining practices by lenders, as well as being part of national efforts related to REO type discrimination as well. And then here in the most recent few years, we have certainly received national attention for some of our clients on appraisal bias, that what they have gone through in alleging discrimination, the appraisal process, that we have investigated and helped in supporting them, being part of the lowball documentary. We have just such powerful clients in being able to tell their story about what they experienced. Our education outreach work, certainly, this month, I always say that people can invite us to speak other months of the year and do things other months of the year. But it's always a very busy, and it's certainly our busiest month this particular year. And we just yesterday was our annual conference. We released 2 new fair housing themed videos. One was a client impact who had gone through really horrific racial type discrimination. And then another video released was on our inclusive communities work, where due to some of our case resolutions, we've been able to put money directly back into neighborhoods that have been harmed by discriminatory practices. And so with that, to keep it short, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Amy, and fellow panelists. So I would like to kind of kick off our discussion this morning with asking all of our panelists the first opening question. There's been a lot of discussion today about home ownership and how home ownership is a key contributor to building wealth and housing stability for households. Given each of your unique background and work experience, can you describe from your perspective how discrimination impacts home ownership, especially for persons of color or communities of color? So with that, if I can start with you, Dimitri, and maybe if we could go down the line, and then if you need me to recap that question, feel free to let me know.
Well, I'm sure our advocates here have plenty to say on this topic, but let me just say that as much as we hear about housing discrimination, just really horrible things on all aspects as it relates to all of the 7 protected classes. And if you're not aware of what those are, that's race, that's national origin, that's color, religion, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, disability, as well as familial status. Familial status, fancy word for there are people 18 years old or under in the household, or someone's pregnant or about to adopt. But so we hear really ugly things. But to the extent we hear really ugly things that happen to people, usually we're most taken aback about how overt fair housing discrimination is. But I gotta tell you how very covert it is. I, as a fair housing practitioner, not when I was working at HUD, but as a fair housing practitioner of several years, I bought a house a few years ago. A couple years later, I get a check in the mail for something just under $2,000. I have no idea why. Turns out the letter that was attached to that check was a letter saying that I was a recipient and part of a settlement agreement between my lender, my very own lender. So essentially I was overcharged, right, when I bought my house. I had no idea. That's just how covert this is. That's why our FIP assistance program, our FAPs are important, our FIPs are important, and it's so critical. I mean, that I was able to obviously deal with having been overcharged because I'm fortunate enough to have had that type of salary. But there are so many people who are just buying a home for the first time. It was my first home that I ever bought. Buying a home for the first time, struggling to get that down payment assistance, struggling to make those monthly payments, and that could have really hit them. Or it could have helped somebody from ever buying that house because of how much it would have cost them. So I just wanted to point out how personal it is to me, this issue, and how much it can really be very, very covert.
You can repeat the question, please.
Sure. So home ownership is really a key contributor to building wealth and stability. Can you describe from your perspective how discrimination impacts home ownership?
Yes, so from the work that we do in the communities we serve, the discrimination impacts because as the communities begin to gentrify, and gentrification can be taken in a positive or a negative way. But the ways that we see it when other cultures come in, it moves Black and brown cultures out, increasing home values that Black and brown cultures cannot afford to obtain home ownership, therefore increasing that gap. So we work really hard with our BIPOC residents or BIPOC pre-home owners to help them understand what the laws are, help them understand options that they have to acquire home ownership so that they can move in that direction, thereby helping to eliminate some of that discrimination.
Thank you.
Okay, it seems to me that there's no question that home ownership affects the wealth, and particularly the wealth of communities in color. And the Fair Housing Act now is 55 years old. But I think it's important to note that you really can't own a home unless you're unbelievably wealthy without getting a loan. And despite the fact that the Fair Housing Act came into effect in 1968, the first successful lending discrimination case did not occur until 1995 when the Justice Department went after the Decatur Savings and Loan in Georgia. And in order to get a loan, you've got to have good credit. And I don't think we can talk about home ownership without talking about the rental situation as well. Because not only do appraisals affect the price of homes and your ability to get a mortgage and all of that, but it also affects what you pay in rent and what renters are faced with. And I think also one of the things that I think went unlooked at for almost 50 years maybe of the Fair Housing Act, we concentrated on discrimination based on both buying a home and renting a home. But we really didn't look at the eviction process, which has a great effect on whether you can purchase a home. If you've been evicted, that affects your credit. And you're not going to get a home, and you're going to be pretty much shut out of the housing buying market. And I think there's been a lack of looking at the eviction process, which is looked at as a landlord-tenant thing. And I can speak from our perspective in the clinic. people come in with landlord-tenant problems, we say, well, unless you have a fair housing problem, we really can't serve you. But most, if you look at eviction court, most of the people there are people of color or people who are from communities of color. And what happens in eviction court really does affect the availability of housing and ultimately whether you are a candidate to purchase a home. So I think one of the things about the pandemic, and I think that we have to focus on not only in who is qualified for a loan, but what is going on in eviction court, how is that affecting people, and how is it later affecting people's ability to purchase housing. And one thing that the pandemic has pointed out, I think, is the problems of sealing evictions, eviction actions being filed, being on people's records, but then they may be settled or people move out voluntarily, or eviction actions may be filed that really aren't really bona fide actions. They're still on people's records. It's still affecting things. So there's a lot of things that affect home ownership beyond the ability to get a loan, beyond the appraisal situation. And all of those things, I think, have to be looked at.
For us, I will localize it for a moment and then take it a little bit wider. In my community, the home ownership rate for whites is 65%, and the biggest gap is with blacks at 34%. So a significant home ownership gap that is there. One of our appraisal clients that we have, that she had gotten her home, she went to get her home refinanced, and she expected to come in around 180. She got 2 appraisals for 110 and 125. And then after whitewashing her home, the appraisal went to 259. So that's the home ownership gap, right? That's the impact, what we heard in the last session about the impact of the wealth gap. There's an example certainly right there. And then, our organization has also been active in using fair housing testing, using data in challenging lenders about their practices. In my community, we have a 30% Black population, yet we find lenders not receiving applications from Blacks or African Americans, certainly not doing originations, having high denial rates, closing bank branches in our majority minority communities, faster. And to date, we have had resolutions or settlement agreements with 2 lenders. We have others certainly that we are working on to get bank branches back into those neighborhoods, loan subsidy programs, donations to groups working on the ground, lots of different things related to that. But when we look at that home ownership gap, as our other panelists have mentioned, it's not just one static type item. It's a reflection of a number of different things. It is in another case, client case that we have. It is the appraiser, the low appraiser, writing up and talking about the grassy area across the street from the home, and the high appraiser noting the beautiful park that is across the street from the home. It's death by 1,000 cuts in the devaluation of Black homes in Black neighborhoods. And that's something that certainly needs to be fought. If we're going to ever close that home ownership gap, it's going to have to be a multifaceted effort in doing that.
Can I just say, Lon, it absolutely has to be multifaceted. And not just from where I sit in the Fair Housing Office. We've got this issue permeates HUD, whole hall of HUD. The majority of people who have FHA insured mortgages are people of color. And so under the Biden-Harris administration, FHA folks, my colleagues over in the FHA side of the building, have actually started to treat school debt, right? Education debt in a way differently than it's previously been treated, because we know Black and brown populations often have an overabundance of school education debt, right? That sometimes, quite often, negatively impacts them when they're trying to get credit to buy homes. Looking at things as, traditionally positive rent payments have not been paid attention to, right? To make sure that people, that's a growing conversation that's taking place right now. So absolutely, it's multifaceted. I agree.
Right, and I'm glad the panel touched on this, because it's like so often we think linearly in the sense of there's one cause to one problem, but in reality, when you really start taking a deep dive into things, there are so many different factors at play that lead to a particular result, and that's one of the things that, in my experience, has made addressing housing discrimination so difficult. So kind of building off of some of these topics that the panel mentioned, I kind of want to dig a little bit deeper into some of those. So Michael, earlier, Michael had indicated he wanted me to address him as Michael, not Professor Sang. I'm so used to referring to him as Professor Sang, so I apologize. So I'm going to try to stick to Michael. So Michael had indicated, it touched upon how you can't get home ownership without access to credit. So my first question, I want to address this to you, Demetria, that one way to overcome the inequities in credit is through the use of special purpose credit programs. But we probably have a lot of people in our audience today who may not be necessarily familiar with those types of programs. Could you take a moment and kind of describe what those programs are and how they could help address inequities in access to credit?
Right. Well, obviously, it was touched upon redlining things of old that we know about. The federal government actually having a hand in some of the issues of the past through the Homeowners Loan Corporation and redlining and things of that nature. So we know, it's clear, the evidence is there that Black and brown people and other underserved communities have been locked out of getting credit to buy homes, right? This is to no surprise to anyone, right? But if we only treat what's happening today and going forward, do we ever truly deal with and remedy the problems of old? And so, believe it or not, it was 1976 when ECOA was amended, right? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was amended and stated that to deal with some of these issues, lenders can have these special purpose credit programs, kind of a tongue twister there, SPCP. But that was 1976, and we've seen very few of those programs since that time. A lot of financial institutions have spoken to some of our sister agencies in government and HUD saying, well, we know about it, but we kind of been afraid of it because we're scared we're going to get hit by a complaint by way of the Fair Housing Act. So under this administration, under Secretary Fudge's leadership, took the time to make sure that HUD made it clear, our Office of General Counsel made it clear, December of 2021, and they wrote an opinion saying that, generally speaking, these type of programs, when they're done in alignment with ECOA and Regulation B of ECOA, they actually do not violate the Fair Housing Act. And so that opinion was written by our Office of General Counsel. I put out a statement supporting that. More importantly, Secretary Fudge and other sister agency heads, CFPB, FHFA, came together to make it clear and to try to urge the financial institutions, please take a look and consider creation of these types of programs so that these programs actually address people who have traditionally been locked down, right, of credit. And going forward, perhaps they could get credit to buy a home. And so since that time, the agency heads continue to push for them, and we have seen a few pop up. One example is Fannie Mae actually has a special purpose credit program, pilot program going on right now. And we're hoping, by way of more influence that the government can use, to see more financial institutions create these type of programs.
Thank you. Amy, did you want to?
Can I just 1 minute comment on that, on how important this is, and big applause to HUD for the issuing of their guidance on this. I've been using and advocating with the lenders we're working with quite a bit. Here's how this is at the local level. This homeownership gap and the equity part equity versus equality part that the previous panel highlighted so well is in some of our resolutions we've had with lenders, we have had a special purpose credit program type product that was tied to the majority minority community and the product going there. And I have learned in being out in the community and talking about these programs, because we are very transparent, we want people to know what it is that we are doing in resolving these cases, is I've heard from the community of, hey, Amy, you're going to gentrify my Black neighborhood now because white people can come into my neighborhood to get access to this loan subsidy product. And then I hear the opposite. Amy, you're segregating me. I cannot take this product and go into a white neighborhood to buy a home. And so what we have seen is a lot of these special purpose credit programs pop up, but they're completely tied to majority minority neighborhood. And instead, like the HUD's memo identified that is possible to do, we need lenders developing a product that can travel with the individual. And that's the only way, well, one of those ways that we're going to close that gap is allowing them to choose where they want to live and having access to that loan product.
So important. Thank you, Amy. Since you have the microphone there, Amy, I think I'll pivot over to you for my next question. You touched upon the work that your office does with investigating discriminatory appraisal cases. And in our audience today, we have a lot of fair housing organizations out there trying to do the same work that your organization does. But one of the things that make those cases so difficult is oftentimes the discrimination is implicit bias, which is very hard to detect. So can you describe or give some guidance for how a fair housing organization can really conduct an investigation to detect when there's potential discriminatory bias in their appraisal?
You know, it's a challenge right now. You know, we've had, because of the national attention we'd received on one of our cases, we received just a number of calls coming into our office. And we've been kind of having to figure this out as we go along. We have used kind of a forensic audit type, hiring an appraiser to do a forensic audit as part of that, certainly reviewing the documents, reviewing the comps, doing mapping, items such as that. But we need more tools in our toolkit in order to be able to do this effectively. One is that I would advocate for the release of better public data that is a HMDA-like product where we can key in on specific lenders and specific appraisers and what they are doing. You can still protect the individual as part of that, but we need better access to data to be able to compare. That's how we've been able to at least try to root out redlining, is through that access to that type of data, and it be not an aggregate type, style product that we are that is being done there. And because I've already mentioned, just a couple examples, of certainly what we've seen fair housing. There's NCRC had a report they released last year about a testing project that they had on the appraisal side. That certainly can be a mechanism for helping to uncover that. But to be honest, we need more things in our toolkit that we can use effectively to be able to root this out. Right now, it's really hard to do that unless it's something really blatant in the appraisal report, because we can't get at the information we need to show evidence of bias.
Thank you so much. I think that's probably going to be a common theme here today, the need for more data. So thank you very much for those comments, Amy. Let me jump back to Athena. Athena, I know you had talked about all the work that your organization does in the community. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the most important resources that your community needs to be able to overcome some of these issues that we've been discussing here today?
So I want to go back to the special credit programs. So one of the things that we do as a HUD agency, we make sure we give our clients the opportunity to have options. So, and we try to create those options specific to where they are in their financial assessment. But the state of Illinois treasurer, he's created a program where their program is attached to the individual and the bank to help close a gap if there's a gap where the client needs more funding, more down payment assistance. It's a very new program, and they're working with our agency to do that. So I wanted to mention that because that's a tool. And that's something that's helping us to help our homeowners get to our potential homeowners get to the next level. As far as other resources, we would need more opportunity for our homeowners, because we're talking about closing the gap, right? We already know that the gap is probably about $200,000 per Black family. So if we're talking about closing the gap, we need more resources to help close the actual principal amount for the payment of the home if we want to keep them in our communities. So I want to talk about the Austin community, for example. We've seen a single family home go from $225,000 up to $375,000 of a purchase price in the last 3 to 5 years. So people who have traditionally lived in that community, if they wanted to purchase, we have to figure out ways to help them be able to close the gap in that funding so that they're able to stay in the communities that they're traditionally from. So that's the biggest resource that we need at this time with the work that we do with our clients.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very useful information. So thank you for sharing that with our audience in the panel here today. Next, I want to move back to Michael. Our panel is kind of in between. The first panel talked about the tax assessment process and how there's inequity in that process, which leads to the overassessment for properties of communities of color, which then leads to a higher tax burden. And on the flip side of that, the panel that's after us is going to be talking more specifically into the issue of discriminatory bias and the undervaluation of homes in communities of color. So can you help us kind of make a little bit of sense of this? What do you see as the core root of the problems that are at issue with the overvaluation and the undervaluation of property?
Yeah, listening to this, I think you could get the idea that this is all very schizophrenic. On the one hand, it serves particularly people of color, low-income people, to have low assessment. That keeps their taxes down. On the other hand, if they're building up wealth, they need high assessments, particularly if they're going to get a second mortgage or all of that type of thing. So I think it really all comes down to a question of fairness here and looking at it from what serves people well. And also, I think in terms of providing more guidance and help for persons in not only being able to get their homes and get a fair appraisal value at that stage, but being able to stay in their homes. So as was mentioned, there's been all kinds of programs in communities that try to put a cap on appraisals and that type of thing, but that has a tendency to backfire. So I guess what we need more is data in how to do this. And I think that goes throughout the area. If we're going to hold appraisers responsible and everything, we have to have clear guidelines and things here as to what can be taken into consideration, what cannot be, how we handle all of this. And right now, I think that is not an area that is of great knowledge to anybody in this area.
Great, very, very insightful. I know we're getting close to the end of time, but there is a question that I kind of want to ask all the panelists. So I'm going to more or less conclude with asking each of you to answer the following question. Which was mentioned earlier, one of the themes that we wanted to do here today, and was especially important for our regional administrator, Shelley, is to kind of structure this narrative around a call to action. And in the audience, we have a number of government and public officials, we have advocacy groups, we have lenders, we have academias. And so what I want to ask each of you to comment on is now is an opportunity for you to make a request as to what actions would you like to see these stakeholders who are in our audience today take to address some of the issues we've talked here today. So why don't we start that kind of in reverse order. So why don't I start with Amy, and then if you could pass the mic down to each of our panelists.
Yeah, and it is, certainly get involved on the appraisal issue. In the most recent years, we are seeing more and more that people's voices will get heard. We need to keep that pressure on, not let this drop out of the news cycle, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get more national, type change. As part of that, Michael and I have already pushed for, we want data, and we want data that is usable for us in conducting our investigations effectively. And then, these kind of things are always a little bit of challenge because we love HUD. HUD provides us, with grants, but I need HUD to move faster in moving toward rulings on cases. These cases, I've got cases that are over 2 years old now, and our clients deserve justice. And HUD, I know that these cases are challenging. These cases have kind of exploded, but we need to get justice for individuals who certainly we feel have encountered bias in the discrimination process.
And I do hear you, Amy.
Yeah, the data is absolutely important, but also is the ability of fair housing groups and things like that to access the data and to evaluate the data. So better training, better computers, equipment, all of that is really needed. And I'm recently been my term on the board on the Woodstock Institute has been renewed, and Amber talked earlier this morning about the work that they do, but we need greater funding, private and public, for groups that do data work and analysis like that, because those types of groups are really vital, I think, in evaluating what is going on and making sure that the law is followed. One thing, though, I would say, I often go to these things and really despair about the future, but I think we've got to give HUD a big hand for their new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. That is significant. If it's if they have the resources to do what they want to do under that rule, and if municipalities and recipients of federal funding really take that rule seriously and it's enforced, I think that can play a big role in all of the problems that we've talked about. I would also urge, though, that the duty to affirmatively fair housing goes beyond HUD. The Fair Housing Act talks about federal regulators and financial people who are not only concerned about soundness of institutions, but need to be concerned about discrimination. So the duty to affirmatively further fair housing goes beyond HUD, and I would like to see every federal agency, from the Department of Agriculture to the Comptroller of Currency to the Treasury Department, come out with an affirmatively furthering fair housing plan and having that agency follow it.
Okay, so as we've been seeing here from the earlier panels and during our conversations, all of this is a compilation of all the needs that we need for things to happen for the actual homeowner. We're talking about data, we're talking about, the fair housing, the different federal administrations. We need policy in place. We need policy in place that's going to effectuate all of these needs, compartmentalize to help decrease that gap for our BIPOC residents. So I'm calling for policy. If that means that I need to work with HUD to pull together some groups, and there's a lot of tables happening out there already. Maybe to pull a person from each of those tables to come together to work towards some type of policy. But there needs to be something in place that will dictate how things need to happen so that we can come back to these panels and say, yes, we have this in place. This is what we're going to do.
Lon, there's so much more to say, and I don't have nearly enough time, but I want to appreciate my co-panelists for bringing up this issue of HUD while we are now pushing for a fiscal 24 budget on Capitol Hill so that we can fortify our staff and get people who have expertise in certain areas so that we can move faster and do a number of things. I appreciate that tee up there. Let me just say this. There's a lot that hasn't yet been said in the time that we have right now. So first of all, I just want to invite you all to HUD.gov/fair housing. There you can find links to the affirmatively furthering fair housing proposed rule. Comments, you want to say call to action? Call to action would be check out the proposed rule. We want to hear from you all. Comments are due April 24th. By April 24th, we'd like for you to get your comments in. This proposed rule, once finalized, will impact states. It'll impact jurisdictions that receive HUD funding. It will impact public housing agencies. It will impact the communities that those organizations and entities serve. It will impact how communities are able to get involved. So please focus on that if you can. There's a lot more I could say about the work we're doing on appraisal discrimination, I would call it. There's the PAVE task force that President Biden pulled together. Secretary Fudge is the co-chair along with Ambassador Rice. And that group pulled together an action plan just over a year ago. They've been working that action plan. What has not been said about appraisal bias is how disproportionate the appraisers are. I think the last data point I heard was that 93% older white males, right? And so what can you do? For instance, the state of Mississippi coordinated with the appraisal subcommittee to get a grant, and now they're actually training and getting more people who more mirror the communities, right, that are being appraised. So there's a lot of work being done. pave.hud.gov, get help to learn more about appraisal bias and appraisal discrimination, as I call it, issues. Way more to be said. We're doing a whole lot. I'll pass the mic since you're saying they're standing there looking like there's time's up.
Well, thank you so much, Demetria. I also have a ton of questions, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to ask them all today. But I just want to close with thanking our panelists. They have took time out of their day to be here today, so we really appreciate you taking the time and to address some of these very difficult issues that we're all working on as a community. So thank you very much.
So don't go too far. We do have a little schedule change due to the scheduling of our next panel. So we are actually going to go right in to our next panel. Obviously, if you need a bio break, feel free to take it, but we're going to go right into the panel, which will give us more time for Q&A at the end. So my pleasure.
We've got to be assertive and aggressive in this process. President Lincoln.
As we transition into the next panel.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Now, we are transitioning right now. They should all be, I think Diane's talked to them all.
I got one. I didn't get it until 10:30.
There we go.
There's no break. No break. We're going right into the. If we can all get settled. I know that everyone's excited about our exciting guests. We had some scheduling difficulties, so we're going right into it so we can accommodate our panelists. If we could all take our seats, please. We're going to move to the next panel. We apologize for the change in schedule. All right. If we can all go ahead and take our seats again, we will go ahead. And it's my pleasure again to introduce my boss and the moderator for this panel, the Regional Administrator, Diane Shelley. Diane?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to ask everyone to please be seated at this time. I know we had promised you a break, but we're going to have to move this along. If everyone could be seated, if you don't, or if you like to stand, just stand quietly. Okay. Okay. Great. Good morning. Let's just jump right into it without introducing the panelists. And without introducing the panelists, I want to ask a question. Who believes there is bias in the appraisal process? If so, please raise your hand. Of the panel? Panelists, I need your attention. I'll ask that question again. Who believes that there is bias in the appraisal process? Okay, I thought we had a consensus. Okay, we're on the right page, we're in the right place. On that note, I want to give each panelist 3 minutes to introduce themselves, their affiliation, and their opinion on flaws in the appraisal industry. Well, I know that one of our panelists is on a very tight schedule. That's why we're moving it along. And I'm going to begin with State Representative Robinson. Congratulations on your recent election to the aldermanic seat in the 4th Ward. But please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Lamont Robinson. I represent the 5th District in the Illinois General Assembly, which goes from South Shore along the lakefront to the River North community. I am also a 15-year Allstate insurance agent. And so being an agent, looking at homeowner appraisals is how we dictate how to insure someone's home. So there are several problems as it relates to home appraisals, and one of them is as it relates to insuring someone's home. And then lastly, as mentioned, I on May 15th will be inaugurated as the next alderman of the 4th Ward. Thank you. And that community goes from Hyde Park up to the Loop and over to River North. So excited to be here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. President and CEO of the Chicago Urban League.
Good morning, and I just have to tell you that I'm honored to be a part of this panel and the overall convening. Thank you, Administrator Shelley, for bringing us together and for including me, and I'm excited to sit next to my new alderman as a member of his community, along with these other distinguished panelists. I am Karen Freeman Wilson, President and CEO of the Chicago Urban League. And I have to say a beneficiary of the great work that has been going on in Region 5 at HUD for a long, long time. Prior to joining the league, I was the mayor of Gary, Indiana. And of course, we are in Region 5, but I've also been the director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. So I have seen this work from a variety of angles. At the league, we are working already with the Appraisal Institute and with others in that realm. And what we understand that is that this is not an appraisal issue or an appraiser's issue. This is something that has a long-standing history, 400 years. And what I like to do is what the administrator has been emphasizing, not just today, but continuously since she got here to Region 5, is to look at solutions. How can we work together to develop solutions? So I'm looking forward to having that conversation today, to telling you what we've done, but also telling you what we're proposing to do and how all of you can be involved. Thank you.
Thank you. And your next panelist is the president of the Appraisal Institute.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Steinley. I am the 2023 president of the Appraisal Institute, as R.A. Shelley said. And I'm so happy to be invited. I want to thank her for putting this together. The Appraisal Institute is the world's largest professional organization of real estate valuers. The Appraisal Institute has been on the forefront of offering solutions. I want to talk to you all about many of those today. Karen mentioned our partnership with the Urban League and some of the things we're doing there. I also want to talk to you about access to data, because we have the same challenges that have been discussed, and I think I bring a solution forward for that as well. The Appraisal Institute is based in Chicago, just so everyone knows. Our national office is over on West Madison. We have about 100, nearly 100 full-time equivalent employees, and most all of them live in the Chicagoland area. I'm very familiar. I feel like this is my second home, come here often. Again, really excited to be here to represent the Appraisal Institute and tell you what we're doing about this issue that has finally reached a level that we've been trying to get it to for many, many years.
Thank you so much. And our next panelist is with the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jane Doko, and I'm the Vice President for Community Development and Policy Studies at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Before I start speaking a little bit more, I need to be very clear that I'm here representing myself as a concerned citizen. I do not speak on behalf of anybody else besides myself. So thank you.
I like that disclaimer. I understand being a federal employee.
And so thank you for the opportunity to for me to keep my job by saying that. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with these distinguished panelists. I'm eager to learn from you all. In a previous life, I worked in the Obama White House and also worked on the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule then, and I was crushed when it was rescinded, in the previous administration. And so, many kudos to our HUD colleagues here. And sort of reviving that role, because its importance is just so vital to our communities. I think, to me, my take on the appraisal industry is that it's such a critical piece of homeownership and just sort of the mortgage underwriting process. I think we've known for a very, very long time that there's appraisal bias, which meaning that there's a difference between sort of what homes are valued at and by appraisers and what they sell for, right? That's a long sort of running phenomenon. I think what's new, and I think what's the reason why we're here today, is that there's bias in appraisal bias, right? And so the set of sort of policies and procedures and practices that sort of are taking place, they may appear to be sort of facially race neutral, but what's happening is that there's more systematic evidence of systematic sort of mistreatment to minorities and communities of color, in sort of how that bias, that appraisal bias, which sort of has always happened since the beginning of time and so on, there's bias in the appraisal bias. And I guess I come here with a lot of optimism. I think over the years the appraisal industry has changed and evolved a lot. From my take, there during the Great Recession and the financial crisis, there were a lot of concerns about conflicts of interest in the appraisal industry, and there were a number of reforms that have took place, and and the appraisal industry they've changed and evolved and changed their practices, and sort of based on that, I come here with just sort of a lot of optimism that there are real solutions to be had on the table.
Thank you for that statement. And I do want to recognize that we do have representation from the mortgage industry in the audience today also. They're not part of the panel, but they are here to listen. Representative Robinson, I know you're on a tight schedule, so I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us about Illinois House Bill 44410, the Real Estate Valuation Task Force Act, and your involvement and its purpose?
Thank you again for the opportunity. I also would like to give kudos to our Cook County Assessor, my friend Fritz Kaegi that's here. It's absolutely good to see you because certainly his office and his team is a part of the issue that's facing our community. As someone that represents middle class and low income communities, particularly in the African American community, our homes are everything. That's all we have. And so as we, and personally looking at national news on the bias around appraisals, and then also giving kudos to the Biden administration for putting forth a task force, and to my friends in the federal government, my thought is that we couldn't wait on the federal government to get their act together. We need to do something in the state of Illinois. And so the task force was to bring in folks from the banking industry, the housing industry, the appraisal industry, to come up with some competencies around appraisals. And we needed to be able to do a couple of things. This has been mentioned in the previous panel, research and data collection, the creation of education and guidance for our folks in the homeowner industry. And then thirdly, develop regulatory proposals to be able to put out there, and then contribute to the oversight bodies for research. Those are the four things that we were looking at as it relates to this task force. We had to do something in order for us to eradicate some of the racial biases that are in appraisals. And my thought is that the best thing that we could do is pull together folks in the industry to get to the bottom of why we were having so many racial biases in appraisals. And so that task force is operating. And my hope is that in the state of Illinois, that we will finally be able to put this to bed and have parity across all appraisals.
Well, the task force pursuant to the act became effective the first of the year, and I understand by its own terms, it will expire in 2029. So obviously, you're goal-oriented. What I found interesting in the act itself is that you identified members and their responsibility. And it went to the sharing of data. What data specifically would you like to see collected by the task force?
One of the data that we like to see, and this is where the education comes in, which is why I'm glad that the assessor is here. When folks feel as though they are wronged or their appraisals are inaccurate, that we need to be able to collect that data. And we need to be able to look at our housing stock, particularly in the city of Chicago, across neighborhoods, whether that be Bronzeville or Beverly. Now, we do have different housing, but again, we need to make sure that we have parity across all appraisals. And that is not what we have today. And so again, collecting that data, getting that information in for folks that unfortunately are feeling as though their appraisal is incorrect, we need to be able to get that information in order to be helpful. And that's why it was important to put this task force together.
And I know you have to run, but I must ask, are there similar statutes in other states?
There are similar statutes in other states. And again, that is why it was important for us to do this in the state of Illinois. We saw this from a national standpoint, but we also knew that in the state of Illinois that we had these same issues. And that is why, and also this was passed with bipartisan support, I want to add, because we also know not only does this happen in Chicago, it happens in downstate in some of our rural communities as well. So the racial bias, as we talk about in the African American community, this also happens in poor rural communities in the state of Illinois. And so unfortunately, we didn't have this task force in place, but we do now. And as you mentioned, it will be up in 2029. My hope is that we can finally get to do the work so that we can end this racial biases in appraisals, not only in the city of Chicago, but across the entire state.
Thank you. Mr. Stanley, the president of the Appraisal Institute, we are putting your industry under the microscope, and you stepped up to participate. I want to thank you. But why are you willing to participate in this discussion?
Thank you again, R.A. Shelley, for the opportunity to be here. The Appraisal Institute, I want to make it clear, is an organization that provides advanced designations for individuals beyond state credentialing. Members of the Appraisal Institute typically have additional education, additional testing, peer review of their work, to make sure that they are being independent and impartial and objective in the appraisals that they produce. So the Appraisal Institute really is the thought leader for the valuation space. And we have had several initiatives, several solutions that we've brought forward to try to help in this issue that has finally received some attention. In 2010, we began by offering scholarships for women and minorities to enter the profession. We believe that representation in the profession is the best way to combat some of the equity and inclusion problems that have been alluded to. The profession, due to the way that the federal government set up the process of entering this business, has become very gentrified. It is primarily Caucasian and older male. I'm a perfect example of that. And we've sought and provided ways in which we can change that. So this has been going on a long time for the Appraisal Institute, and we've been trying to bring this forward, and we're really glad for the opportunity now to talk about some of these solutions. I believe you're going to ask me about some of those, so I'll stop here at this point, but that's why we're here. We definitely want to communicate about this issue. We're the independent third party in a financing transaction. The lender usually has a financial interest. The realtors may have a financial interest, but the appraiser is truly the independent and impartial party. And without appraisers, we end up with circumstances like we saw in 2008 and 2009, where exuberance in the lending market unchecked leads to some pretty significant consequences. And so that's why appraisers are in the process to make sure that there's some independence in terms of the analysis.
Well, thank you for bringing up the demographic makeup of the industry and also diversity, the need for diversity. But let's talk about, how do you become an appraiser? Let's educate our people here in the live audience and people online. How do we become an appraiser?
To become an appraiser, to obtain a state credential to be an appraiser, and there's different levels of credentialing, but there are three key components. There's the education that's required, which we call qualifying education, or QE, and there's a different amount if you're going to appraise commercial properties than residential properties, for example. Then there's the experience piece, where you, to become an appraiser, have to obtain a certain level of experience, which again grows with the type of credential that you're seeking to obtain. And that model that was provided by the Appraisal Subcommittee and the Appraisal Foundation since the beginning of state licensing. State licensing came about in 1989 with a savings and loan crisis, FIREA. Federal legislation at that time, Title 11 of FIREA, dictated to the states that they had to set up a state regulatory regime that issues these credentials. And so from that point forward then, the only way to gain experience to enter the profession was to find an appraiser who would mentor you, who would supervise you, the traditional supervisor trainee model. And the third component, after getting education and experience, is the national exam, the National Uniform Licensing Exam, which is the same for all states. And again, it's more difficult depending upon which licensing credential that you're trying to obtain. So education has been readily available. There have been some financial challenges, and one of the things I'd like to talk to you about, our Appraiser Diversity Initiative has sought to lessen that problem. The experience piece, where you have to know someone to get into the business, has always been a difficult business model. We've lobbied a long time for a change, and I have great news about that, an alternative to that model that we've worked on and are bringing forward. And finally, the exam piece, don't have any control over the exam. That's something that you just have to pass.
Well, thank you for that background, that context. And turning to your fellow panelists, President Karen Freeman Wilson of the Urban League, you're sitting next to the president of the Appraisal Institute. Do you have any suggestions that he can take back to his membership?
Well, the great news is this isn't my first opportunity to work with the Appraisal Institute. As he alluded to earlier, our National Urban League is working with them, and I have been a part of a committee. I think when we look at the three criteria, if you will, the diversity initiative is great because it provides for a pathway for some. We always want to think about how do you provide the greatest pathway. I think that you always want to watch out for barriers to entry, and to say that education is required. That's important. We all want to ensure that people understand the process, understand what they're doing. As an example, you don't want a dentist who hasn't had some training in dentistry. You don't want someone in cosmetology who hasn't had some training in that area. The same should be true for appraisals. The importance, I think, of this educational process is to make sure that that education is relevant and is equally available to all who want to be an appraiser throughout communities here and throughout other places. The experience part is an area that we have historically been concerned about, because with the experience historically only being someone who's willing to mentor you, that is a red flag. We have to be clear on that because if we are saying that we have an industry that is largely made up of white males, unless they have a diverse professional group or a diverse mentee group, then they will provide experience opportunities to white males. And so how do we diversify that option? The new process, and I believe it's an online process, is certainly a good thing. The diversity initiative is a good thing. But I think if you look at the demographics of the industry, that process has to be accelerated. So I would just make that recommendation. And then, while the exam is the exam, I can think of probably 2 or 3 exams. I've taken them, the bar, other exams where it's not always testing competency or the ability to succeed in a particular field. It's just another barrier. And so you have to carefully look at that exam to make sure that it's testing competency and it's not simply providing limitations. But I think that the last piece of advice I would give is having these conversations as they're already doing with the National Urban League, with local affiliates, with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, with local affiliates, with organizations that are committed to equity, like NHS here in Chicago and others. Having Cook County Bar, the realtors, the realtors, that's all extremely important to solving this solution or solving this challenge.
Thank you so much. And before I turn to Ms. Doko, I have a question for Mr. Stanley. I've been in some rooms where they discussed addressing the lack of mentorship by actually requiring it in the continuing education portion, where you would have to mentor someone of a different demographic in order to qualify for your continuing education. Now, is there any validity to that, or has there been discussions along that line?
Well, I want to address that by talking about what's being done to solve the experience piece, where you have to find a supervisor willing to train you. In my experience, I've been at this for a long time now, and I've brought 4 individuals into the profession. All 4 of them are people I still get to work with every day. I long ago quit saying they work for me, because that's not nearly true if you met them. They're all 4 females, and frankly, they're all brighter than I am. And so I'm just excited that I get to continue to work with them. But it was clear, and long ago, the profession, the Appraisal Institute in particular, and the regulators, the appraiser regulators, were calling out to the entities that were responsible for establishing the trainee mentor model, and that would be the Appraisal Foundation and the Appraisal Subcommittee, which kind of set the way in which we become appraisers, that something else was needed. And that something else is called PAREA, Practical Applications of Real Estate Appraisal. AI's PAREA is about to launch, and it is I call it the flight simulator for appraisers. I've borrowed that term from someone else in the industry, but it essentially allows you in a virtual and online way to gather experience, to measure homes, to complete appraisal reports, and do that with a mentor, which is provided by the PAREA provider. But it's much less intense than actually supervising somebody, as I have done with the individuals that I told you about. So AI PAREA, in order to launch that, we invested $2 million of our members' money. We obtained a $500,000 grant from the Appraisal Foundation. We have a guaranteed launch date of September 1st for AI PAREA. We built a technological backbone that can support hundreds of individuals getting their experience at the same time in this virtual and simulated way. You won't any longer have to know someone or talk to someone to be your supervisor. And I really think in terms of representation, equity and inclusion in the profession, this will open a lot of doors for individuals who have wanted to become part of this profession. And I want to say clearly, this profession has been very rewarding for many of us. It's a wonderful way to get to know people, to help them as they grow their financial equity. But those doors are now opening with things like AI PAREA and the Appraiser Diversity Initiative that you heard Karen talk about. These are the ways in which we will hopefully allow more doors into the profession, and the diversity will take care of itself that way. The appraisers that are working will look like the communities in which they are working in.
Ms. Doko, I read one of your blogs that spoke of the need for immediate intervention to help close economic gaps, to keep Black and Brown people from falling farther behind. Although not the focus of your blog, you mentioned mortgage loan products that would help homeowners build equity faster. Do you have any recommendations for the appraisal industry that will lead to quicker and more equity?
Sure. First, I want to thank you for reading my blog. Most people don't really read my stuff, and so thank you for that. So the blog was about framing the opportunities to close racial and ethnic economic gaps that were at risk of widening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And, among the many different economic gaps, one important reason for why Black and Latinx families lose out on building housing equity is that they buy high and sell low. And that's something that, the blog describes. And so, why are they buying high and selling low? It's in part because they're more likely to face, distressed sales. Right? They're more likely to lose a job. They're more likely to experience a health shock. And so, when times are bad and house prices fall, they have fewer assets to weather these job losses or health shocks. And, and so that's why they sort of enter the distress sales process and then, are in a position where they're, selling their homes at a discount. And so this is, a phenomenon that's, characterized that I think many people have personal experiences with, but also, it's documented sort of in some research. And so my point about mortgage products is about how do you, sort of create these like contractual obligations, around lending to better enable families to insure against house price declines and some of the shocks that they experience, economic shocks that are hit, so that when something bad happens, families don't have to sell their homes to sort of get out of this financial trouble. They, either have equity in their homes that they can tap, or sort of have other, assets to financial assets to draw on. I mean, in terms of, the recommendations for appraisers, I, as a researcher, I'm in no business of telling anybody what to do and sort of how to do it better. I think what, some of my research and sort of some of my thinking and work on sort of housing finance more generally, what that points to is just sort of the critical importance of getting appraisals right in the mortgage underwriting process, right? It's important, because it, opens a door for access to credit. Overvaluation sort of leads to problems. Undervaluation, also leads to problems. And it just, there's just so much care and, professional conduct, policies, procedures, regulations, and so on and so forth that go into getting it right. And so I guess I'll just sort of turn the question around and just being like, well, what needs to happen in order to help the appraisal industry, get it right? And I think, we've alluded to, some of the improvements in data and sort of data collection. And I'll sort of, we've sort of talked a little bit about, some of the data that gets collected under the HMDA. There's no field there for appraised values, right? And so when we see that mortgages are denied, we don't have a good sense for, whether, sort of appraisals and the mismatch in sort of appraised values and, property values, was a driver of those mortgage denials. We can't see whether the mismatch in appraised values and sale prices and are like systematically vary by race and ethnicity and and where those problems are the largest, which communities, which lenders, and it's very, very hard to diagnose the challenge. And also to understand sort of the scale of the challenge, and then to really have a focused understanding of how and where to direct our resources and efforts. And so, in some sense, like that's my hope, like to have sort of a broader conversations, like how do we like just the system do better in sort of helping the appraisers get it right, because it is such a critical piece into mortgage underwriting.
The mantra, data, data, data. Mr. Stanley, did you?
I really wanted to follow up on the data point. I was so pleased when Assessor Fritz talked about the uniform appraisal data set. Some years ago, beginning in 2010, the federal government, now through FHFA, the conservators of Fannie and Freddie, started standardizing the data that appraisers collect and report in the appraisal reports. Every time that an individual in my firm submits an appraisal to a lender for conventional financing that's going to eventually be pooled by Fannie or Freddie, that data in the appraisal report is lifted and kept. It is the best data available. It is the data of an appraiser like me who's been in the house, who spent probably upwards of an hour making sure I understood the physical characteristics of the property, the workmanship and materials that are used, the condition, as Assessor Kaegi said. And that information then is collected by Fannie and Freddie. We don't have access to that information. When I do an appraisal and I use a comparable sale down the street, I don't have access to that information from other appraisers who did the appraisal work. And it is the best data. It exceeds county assessor data simply because, as you said, Fritz, you guys don't often get inside the properties and see the condition and so forth. The Appraisal Institute for a long time has been advocating for the release of that data, protecting privacy, of course, but releasing that data to practitioners to the point that was just made, to get the appraisals right. Otherwise, we are confined as appraisers to the same data that you might have as an assessor or just a neighbor. You know what it looks like on the outside. You might have the benefit of some MLS photos, but not always. And you don't have the appraiser's fine work that has been captured by the federal government. So I think that data, which the assessors would like to have access to, clearly it's there and we need broader access. We've been asking for help on that for a long time, and I hope conversations like this with very important policymakers such as R.A. Shelley and the access to the findings of the PAVE report, all of that can help to release that data so that all of us can do a better job of getting it right.
Ms. Doko?
If I could just respond to that a little bit, just one brief thing. So that's a great data set. I think HMDA is also a great data set. HMDA has a universal loan identifier. And, I think being able to merge those two data sets, I think would really enrich our understanding of the role of appraisals in the mortgage underwriting process and the nature of sort of like the biases that arise, where they're important, which lenders, and just really just broaden and enrich.
No, thank you so much. And I hope all of our online participants are taking notes. But I'm going to.
All right, Shelley, I just have, just as an educational for myself.
Yes.
Who has an interest in not having that data released? What have been kind of the challenges to getting wholesale release of that data?
Karen, were you asking me? Is that all right?
Yeah. Well, I was asking for permission to ask you. Yeah.
Well, my co-moderator has posed a question. No, I'm just teasing. Now, this is the kind of exchange that we had hoped for. So thank you. Yes, please.
Oh, okay, great. I don't know the answer to that. That data is controlled by Fannie and Freddie and their conservator FHFA. It is therefore controlled by the federal government. There have been concerns about privacy. Releasing some of the HMDA data, for example, has loan values, loan amounts, and perhaps credit scores, and some of those things that get to personally identifying individuals. And I understand that concern, but when you're talking about property characteristics, physical footprint of the property, condition ratings, quality ratings, what's been used to construct it, has it been properly maintained, or is there areas of deferred maintenance? to me, those don't seem like they would cross any sort of privacy concerns, or at least they could be aggregated in a way that it would be helpful. And you heard one of the previous panels talk about the release of the UAD data in an aggregated form, and that's been helpful. But again, it doesn't allow property-specific information to practitioners who are appraising your house and wanting the detailed information on the other houses that have sold so they can really get the appraisal right. Anytime we hear one of these stories about a family who feels that the color of their skin affected the appraisal, it's really upsetting because it goes against everything that we stand for as appraisers. And part of that, of course, is dealing with competent, properly trained individuals who have access to the data. I would suggest that some of the subpar appraisals could be avoided if you as a consumer would make sure that the appraiser that you're relying on really has additional credentials like I've talked about before from the Appraisal Institute.
I appreciate this discussion, and I think that you have been so, on point as far as the need for data. Excuse my Midwestern accent. I say data, not data. But I want you to know that internally, conversations are being had. This administration, as I said at the beginning, is looking at everything through a lens of equity. Our Cook County Assessor has raised this issue through his association, and maybe the next forum will have someone that can specifically address that issue. But this is a multifaceted issue that we're talking about here today. And thank you for that piece. But I want to turn back to President Karen Freeman Wilson. You're on the ground. What is the effect of lower property values on school funding, emergency responses, and other critical services?
The impact of these lower appraisals and lower home values have, one, been seen over the history of this community and have an impact for generations to come. People send their children to school because they're able to borrow against the equity in their homes. So if my home is undervalued or if my mortgage is predatory, I don't have that opportunity. So my child, even if he or she has the acumen to attend college and the desire, then is forced to take student debt. That student debt then impacts their ability to purchase a home when they graduate from college, providing they've done well and they have the ability and, in terms of income, to secure a loan. It's limited because, again, they have this big student loan payment that they're saddled with even when they come out. Maybe I want to open a business, start a business. Generally, people utilize the equity in their home to borrow against to start a business. Well, if I don't have that, then I've got to string credit cards together at a much higher interest rate to secure capital to start a business. Or if I go to the bank and they say, well, what collateral do you have? You say, well, I have a home, but they evaluate my home. And again, it doesn't provide the equity that I need to start that business. And then, of course, you referred to it earlier, the educational opportunities. It is just criminal that we fund education based on home values. That shouldn't be. We've got to determine another way to do that, because all we're doing is putting our young people further and further behind. And then we say, well, why aren't you achieving? Why aren't you excelling? Well, you've already placed them behind the day they walk into kindergarten because of the funding that you are not providing for their education. And so, and we don't even have to talk about the land contracts, and we don't have to talk about the way that the segregation occurred. We don't have to talk about that. But just by the lack of home value that we're seeing, we have a real challenge that we have to correct. And I won't even say the R word, which is reparations, because that's really the only way that we're going to correct this problem. We can talk about what we do going forward, but we have to address what happened in the past.
So we've heard about data, we've heard about what it looks like on the ground, the long-term effects. And I wanted to turn back to Ms. Doko, because I know that the Federal Reserve has been involved with the PAVE task force. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about the Federal Reserve's involvement with the PAVE task force?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the Fed's role in the task force stems from its responsibilities in enforcing fair lending laws. And so, as background, this is an interagency task force. I think you've probably heard a lot about it. And there's an action plan that specifies 21 specific actions that the agency is committed to take in order to eliminate bias and advance equity in home appraisals. And among the many actions, the Fed, so this is the Federal Reserve Board in DC, they signed onto a comment letter to the Appraisal Foundation to advocate for consistency and anti-discrimination standards between federal law and appraisal standards. The Fed also committed to ensuring that appraisers or regulated institutions use of appraisals are included in fair housing and INCOA compliance requirements and considered in every review of relevant existing and future policies and guidance. And then they also will expand regulatory agency examination procedures of mortgage lenders, as well as conduct annual data analysis to look for appraisal bias. And so these are some of the actions that the Federal Reserve Board has committed to, as part of this task force under its responsibilities enforcing fair lending laws.
Thank you so much. I have like 4 more pages of questions, but I'm being told that we're nearing the end of our time. And I want to give each of you an opportunity to make a very short closing statement. And we'll just do it in order of your seating.
Well, again, my sincere thanks for the opportunity to join this group and this convening. I appreciate the work that HUD is doing. Love the PAVE report and that it has a 21-step action plan, because really that's what we have to do. We have to engage in action. I would point out that I'm joined today also by Dr. Lionel Kimball, who leads our Research and Policy Center. And there are a number of reports on that site at shiul.org that point to this issue. And this month, we will be coming out with, again, solutions that are in the form of a task force to look at this from all angles. And HUD will be represented on that task force thanks to R.A. Shelley's previous consent, but many of the folks in this room will be represented, or at least asked to be represented, as we work towards a solution. And we are the Chicago Urban League at your service for 107 years.
Thank you. Mr. Stanley?
Well, thank you again, R.A. Shelley, for allowing me to sit on the panel with Karen and Jane and to provide some thoughts on what's happening inside the appraisal industry led by the Appraisal Institute. I would ask each of you in closing to consider helping the profession by providing those who might have an interest in joining us as appraisers to check out the Appraiser Diversity Initiative. You can Google Appraisal Diversity Initiative. You'll end up on a landing page at the Appraisal Institute. It was called out in the PAVE action report. It was specifically identified. It's a partnership between the Appraisal Institute, the National Urban League, and Fannie and Freddie. And I want to tell you about the impact of that as I close here, which is we've had 450 already scholarship winners that get a full ride for their education. They are primarily diverse individuals. I live in South Dakota. We have a lot of tribal land. There's not a lot of appraisers in tribal land areas, and we need them. So those are the kind of people who are getting these scholarships. There are already 50 of those that have graduated and are working in the industry. I know the Mississippi program through the appraisal subcommittee was called out earlier, but in the past 2 years now, there have been 50 already through the ADI, thanks to the National Urban League and Fannie and Freddie and our leadership. So if there are individuals who you feel haven't had an open pathway to the profession, the Appraisal Institute is working with our stakeholder partners to try to make that happen. And I would really encourage you to have them check that out. Between scholarships and PAREA and access to data, the things that we're trying to do, we really are glad that others are joining us in solving this issue. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, and thank you for mentioning our tribal communities. Thank you for the work that you're doing with our tribal communities. Ms. Doko?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on this panel and for the opportunity to learn from such a distinguished group of panelists. I guess I will, my closing thoughts, I'll highlight something small and then highlight something big. One issue where the Chicago Fed has been very active in concerns lead service lines and the very large presence of them in the city of Chicago and in sort of our region more generally. This is the pipe that connects, the water main to people's homes, and it exposes, families and children to like the risk of, toxic lead exposure. Chicago has, nearly 400,000 of them. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that the EPA has a regulation under the lead and copper rule, I believe, that will mandate the disclosure of these lead service lines. And so they're, working, their efforts underway to sort of identify where they are, which homes are affected, and so on and so forth. This can, through appraisals and so through, the process of that can affect the housing market in pretty serious and, important and impactful ways, both sort of on valuation as well as, some communities will have the resources to remove these lines, some communities will not. And, that sort of, risks, further widening, existing disparities and stuff like that. This is an issue that, that I personally, care a lot about, and, there are research efforts underway to just kind of better understand and document this phenomenon. And, I think this is sort of an issue that, where just sort of, how do we appraise, sort of this information, this new information about properties? And so, I would really, love to work with, all of you, in this room on just sort of being able to diagnose and, think clearly both, about the problem as well as, the set of solutions around this issue. Now I'm going to zoom out like 100,000 to like 100,000 feet and just kind of flag that, to me, there's a really big public policy question about, if we as a society make progress on the bias in appraisal bias and so on and so forth, how much closer do we get to addressing all of the other racial disparities in housing markets and economic opportunity. I mean, to me, that's like the bigger question. It's one about magnitudes. It's one about and about just wide-ranging solutions and so on and so forth. And there, I don't know the answers to that question, but like I just kind of want to broaden sort of, I guess, people's perspective, right? I think I'm excited to be talking about a very, very narrow problem. I think we've surfaced a lot of really exciting actions, and there's a lot of momentum already sort of underway. But then there's sort of this like bigger public policy problem and challenge.
Well, thank you for challenging us. I heard someone whisper, will there be a Q&A? I'm going to check with our MC.
We were going to do it as part of the closing. I think we can thank the panel, then we'll go to the closing.
Okay, very good. Well, I definitely want to thank the panelists. I want to thank all the panelists, but President Freeman Wilson, President Stanley, Ms. Doko, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Mr. Cunningham. If you would like to remain seated where you are, because we are going to have a Q&A, and there may be some questions directed to you also.
I'll be brief. You can stay up.
Okay.
Well, great. Thank you so much. That concludes our panel presentation today. What we really wanted to do, and you kind of heard this throughout the day, is kind of how do we go forward from what we've learned today, what we've heard today. We've had 3 excellent panels, an excellent keynote speaker from the White House. So I'm just going to ask our hosts to come up and have a closing session, and I think we're going to give the opportunity for some Q&A. So Assessor Kagi, Regional Administrator Shelley, I turn it over to you, and I'm going to give you both. You can either take turns here. I can get both handheld marks. This is one thing we didn't think about.
I'm fine here. Assessor? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Well, this is wonderful. I think we're all, we've had a lot of intellectual nourishment here before we go out and get the real nourishment. And what an amazing grouping of people here. As I think about the 21-point plan that Erica mentioned on appraisal bias, that's an example of how, when you're working on issues of economic equity, sometimes you don't have one big thing that you can do. You're struggling against a lot of structural forces that you have to work on simultaneously. It requires a lot of cooperation amongst us actors and community groups. It also requires you. We hope you've all become smarter and equipped for action today, and there's a lot that we can do on that. The interesting thing about the assessment gap is actually we don't need 21 things. There's really one big thing that we need, and the panelists all mention this because, as the co-panelist that I had, Professor Berry, identified that really a really big part of the assessment gap is just not having qualitative information about homes. And if we can get at that, then we can talk about the impact. I mentioned it can be like about $600 for a home in the Chicago area if you're off by $30,000, and that's the difference between knowing if a kitchen or bathroom is below average or average. And we have that data. The federal government has that data. It's in that uniform appraisal data set. Every home that's been refinanced, every home that has a federally guaranteed mortgage through not only Fannie or Freddie, but also the FHA and the VA, it's all gone into a national database for over a decade now. It's over 100 million homes. Sometimes it's a couple instances on each home, so it's getting up to date. And the proposal that our group has before the federal government is very simple, is that there are a couple of us counties want to do a pilot project to show that, hey, here's the assessments they're actually going to do without this data. but we're also going to do a pilot where we simultaneously do our assessments with that data. We'll show you what the assessments would have been if you give us that data, and you can see the difference. And so the proposal that we have before the FHFA, which controls this data, it's the regulator, is that Cook County and then Maricopa County in Arizona, which is a county as big as ours, very vast landscape, very diverse, has some different issues, but some of the same issues. We could show that difference. And we talk a lot about, we can use kind of fancy terms like these acronyms like the FHFA and conservatorship. That's what Fannie and Freddie are under. Conservatorship is a way of saying the federal government owns Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They are federally chartered enterprises, and we, the American people, own them. That's our data. So all we have to do is open up this data, we can solve this big problem. So sometimes you have one big solution, sometimes you have many. But with this, Dr. Shelley, should we go right to questions, or where should I hand it to you and then you can open up for questions? Great.
Oh, please stay.
Okay.
First of all, I want to address your call to action, and that's why we're here today. Being part of the federal government, I understand that there has been a history that we have to undo and then address the wrongs of that prior activity. So your request is not being ignored. It's just the process. And again, I hope to bring back additional information to you. But I do want to talk about the tools that we have mentioned here today, and that is leveraging data. We've talked about a well-trained appraisal and appraisal profession, and we've talked about the PAVE action plan. The action plan is something that has really focused attention not only on the consumer, but also on industries. We've educated the consumer as to speaking up, questioning the appraisal process. But we've also gone to the industries and asked, how can we make this a better industry? I want you to know that HUD has awarded $54 million in grants across 42 states designed to curb appraisal bias. And the Federal Housing Finance Agency publishes data sets of aggregate data, which is the criticism here today. But they do publish the aggregate data. HUD and FHFA is working to build a better database. More details to come. But what we need is for the continued conversations. I think this morning has been very beneficial. It's been beneficial for me, and I thank you for collaborating with HUD. I think you've heard enough from us. I'm going to turn this over to the audience. I know that our FHEO director is still here. If you have questions, Mr. Cunningham will hand you the mic, and please, if you could just limit your questions so that we can get around the room.
Absolutely. Okay, so my question is on behalf of Woodstock and just the call for data, and it's a bit sassy. I've been tasked, so just please, we've been in this game 50 years, it's lots of frustration. So the question is, why do nonprofits and universities have to ask for additional data that the federal government has so they can enforce a federal law? Isn't that supposed to be the job? And is it not being enforced effectively? Sorry for the sass, but I was asked to ask you just like that.
No, it's an appropriate question. I think maybe people have heard of this concept of dialectical materialism. It's through the clashing together, the clashing that you produce a better product. So I don't have an answer as to why it is not available today. But keep in mind that this administration has been in office a little over 2 years, and I elevate and amplify some of the great work it's done with the PAVE task force. And you will continue to see things. Actually, if I have this date correct, on April 27th, there will be an event, and some of these issues may be discussed at that time.
I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. My name is Frank Williams, F.J. Williams Realty, LLC. 1968, I was a licensee when we received the fair housing, and I was excited and very proud and thought that that was going to be the solution to all of our problems. 1973 and 1974, I was president of our realtors group here in Chicago, the Dearborn Real Estate Board. 1979 to 1985, I was president of Southside Branch NAACP, Edwin C. Billberry, and you know the gang. And in 1990, the president of Chicago Association of Realtors. I give those credentials because we've been here before. We've talked about this before. I've been a licensed appraiser since 1975. Wasn't licensed then, we were permitted to be able to appraise before we were licensed in, I guess, 1990, 1991. We've been here before. It seems like to me we're talking the same old soup warmed over. We don't talk about reparation. We don't talk about articles of agreement, land contracts, and the denials. And organized real estate gave him a tough proposition when he took over as assessor. The Association of Realtors gave him hell. And we're standing here today still talking about not aggressively moving forward with these kinds of things, that the denial, the aggression was a conspiracy with FHA, the Appraisal Institute, the National Association of Realtors, and all the other entities to have zoning separation. President Lincoln said very candidly that separation of the races was important for the country to be segregated. So we had appraisal bias starting at Emancipation Proclamation. I would hope that we'd start to be aggressively, and that 450 is not a very big number for appraisal trainees. The National Association of Realtors say 400 appraisal trainees. That's not aggression in 50 states. I thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you for your comment and your years of service. Any other questions?
Thank you. This one might be a little sassy too. My apologies. Thank you very much for everyone coming and speaking and really helping shed light on some really important issues that we're facing not only in the city but also in the country. My question is in regards to the multifaceted nature of these issues across different racial demographics. From the flyers that were sent out, I'm not seeing like panelist names coming from organizations that represent the Latino community or other immigrant communities throughout the city. And I was that leaves out a very important part of the question, and in the changing nature of the demographics of the city of Chicago as well as the country. My question is, in further iterations of this conversation that we're having here today, how are the powers that set up these kinds of conversations in these kinds of spaces, how are they going to fix that problem? And in terms of the immediate next iteration of this kind of event, how are you guys planning to incorporate more voices in this conversation to really get a good handle on what these problems look like across communities in Chicago and across the country? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all, I appreciate the tenor of your reflection there. Latino communities and other immigrant communities are actually just as impacted by all of the things that we were talking about, where we've that we've talked about on this panel today. Not only Black people, but also Latino people have more of their wealth invested in their home than other racial groups. So they have more on the line, from issues that concern access to the federal mortgage financing system, so that they get the opportunity to build wealth, which is the work of PAVE, but also the assessment gap. And this is what, we're worried about this here in Cook County, because we think that in communities that are experiencing gentrification, which some Latino communities in Chicago and Cook County are especially experiencing, this is an especially important issue for them. So I just want you to know that it goes directly to them. And our assessor colleagues who wrote this letter to the White House, there are 15 of them, several are Latino assessors representing majority Latino communities in Miami, in Maricopa County, and some communities out in California. So know that as part of our group, this is front and center to us. We always want to get wider participation on panels. That's what I'd add.
Well, I know that we do have more representation as far as attendance that's online. We are in the PAVE generation. I'm sorry, I slipped. In the COVID generation, where a lot of people enjoy these kind of events online. But I think you raised a valid point as far as our panelists. There could have been more representation. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. I do want you to know that we've reached out to our Latinx community directly and invited them to attend.
Any other questions? Go.
Hi, sorry, contributing more to the sassy questions. I'm a fair housing advocate. I work out in the west suburbs, and I've been working on appraisal projects for over a year now. I've attended lots and lots of panels, and I think the question that I always walk away with is, how do we do something? I think a lot of the panels have focused a lot on establishing and reestablishing the loss in wealth in Black, Latinx communities, which actually studies have shown face higher degrees of devaluation, see it more frequently, but they're not addressing other communities too, like same-sex couples, single parents, immigrant communities, et cetera, who likely face this as well. But other than requesting more data, the big question is, how do we enforce fair housing laws on appraisers? How do we advocate for our clients? How do we educate appraisers on their fair housing responsibilities? Because I don't think there's hardly any guidance anywhere, and it's something we struggle with a lot of. We have clients who are facing discrimination, or we believe are facing discrimination, but how can we help them? It's established that they've lost wealth, but what do we do next?
Did one of the panelists want to respond to that? And I know Amy Nelson, maybe you wanted to respond also?
So what I would say to you is that's really what our task force is looking to do. We don't believe that this is simply an appraiser's issue or an appraisal issue. We think that the banking community has some ownership here. We think that mortgage brokers have ownership. We think that all levels of the federal government, not just our assessor and not just our HUD personnel, but there are some things that the city Department of Housing can do. And so our solution is to sit down and pick this whole process apart. And I think it's right. I think that Mr. Williams is right that we really have to go to the heart of the process in saying, okay, we know these laws are on the books. We know these processes are on the books. Why aren't these laws serving us? Do we need to educate people more? Do we need to make sure that they know about the laws? Do we need to get more people involved in the process? yes, diversity is important, but while we're achieving that diversity in the appraisal industry, how do we inform homeowners? How do we inform people who are getting these appraisals? I know NHS has a project going now. What can I do if I think I'm being lowballed? What can I do? What are my remedies that are available? And that's why it's important to raise this not just in April, but all the months of the year.
May I address that question? I really appreciate the question about education. The Appraisal Institute is advocating for unconscious bias and fair housing training for appraisers across the country, more than any other profession that is affected by fair housing laws. We've written model legislation. We're helping that get passed in the states because I do believe education is part of the solution to make sure that practitioners, whether they're simply at a state certification level without being involved in a professional organization, or even those in a professional organization, should experience that education on a regular basis, not just one time, but on a regular basis. The second thing is, and you mentioned this, when you have homeowners who feel that something has happened in this area, what can they do? We have really tried to get the regulators like the Federal Reserve and all of the federal banking regulators together to create a consistent reconsideration of value process, ROV process, so that a homeowner can disrupt what they feel is appraisal bias early in the process and not after it's already been experienced. And the issue that we have is across the various federally regulated lending institutions, there's no consistency in the way consumers can provide a request for an ROV, a reconsideration of value. There's no consistency in the way appraisers get that information and are asked to reconsider what they've done. So if we're really going to disrupt appraisal bias, we have to standardize that ROV process. And that's something much like the agencies got together and did the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines. That was a feat that was done by the Federal Reserve and the OCC and Fannie and Freddie, all of through the FHFA, et cetera, FDIC, NCUA, they all got together and created that document. And we feel that they could do the same on a reconsideration of value process to protect consumers' rights and also standardize that process for interacting with appraisals to disrupt the bias that some feel that they're receiving in their appraisals.
And if I could just add to some of this, last fall I had the great fortune of meeting Heather Abraham, who's a legal scholar out in New York, and what she taught me was that there are opportunities, I think, for homeowners or potential home buyers, to work with fair housing centers as well as law clinics. And Professor Abraham, she has a really interesting just law review article that offers sort of like a how-to guide for how, in cases where there is discrimination in the appraisal process, how lawyers can sue and under current sort of existing laws. And so I just kind of want to point to those resources and opportunities there.
I'll just speak specifically as a FIP organization and what FIP organizations, because that is all awesome, but that's more of a larger type view for FIP organizations. What I had talked about before, we need more tools in our toolkit. I would love to see HUD when these type of on these issues that are really more systemic, maybe in working with the systemic investigations unit at HUD, that there is a training program that allows then FIPS and FAPs to be able to come in and we dig in on this. We don't talk big brush. We dig in. Here's what we need to look at on an appraisal document. Here are some things that you can do as part of this investigation. That type of in the weeds type work so that we can better train our staffs in being able to put together effective investigations. And as I mentioned up in the panel, we need HUD to issue some rulings. So we know where the legal issues are or are not. And so that we know in putting these cases together, we've got to move some cases through to rulings. The last thing I'll say is, again, I'm only addressing the FIP portion here that he asked about, is most fair housing organizations in the country doing this work, the average staff size is 7 people. And you cannot be expecting those groups to be carrying this load, yet you look at the cases that are making the news, traditionally have come through a fair housing organization. So one of the things HUD could help us in doing, besides the training model, is, and I know HUD is starting to get more grants out, things like that, but move fair housing organizations through a funding model that is similar to what FAP agencies have. I spend so much resources writing grants to HUD. 1 to 2 week grant, 2 weeks to write, and we've had opportunities for so many wonderful grants, but that is all time me and my staff take away from an investigation. And move us through up to a better mechanism that then we can plan for the future, add staff to our team that we know are going to be there for years to come, and not reliant upon 1 year to the next in that funding mechanism.
Maybe did our attorney Madelson, did you want to say anything?
Quick comment here.
Just a quick comment also for context of for like why we need these types of guidance. If you've seen Lowballed, one of the families in Marin City whose home was devalued by $500,000 because we don't have these guidances, ultimately their case resolved, and the only finding was that the appraiser had to pay a $2,000 fine for a licensing violation. The homeowners got nothing. Is that justice?
So first, I just wanted to comment regarding Amy's suggestion. So there were a lot of good points in there that we can definitely take back, and I could take back to Demetria. Unfortunately, she's just no longer at this event, but I can definitely take those back to her. But I do want to indicate that from the HUD perspective on the cases that are being investigated by our offices, we do work very closely with our Office of Systemic Investigations, and there's close coordination on the investigation of these types of cases. And so it's been a learning curve for, I think, all of us. We've learned a lot over the last 2 years. And, hopefully I hear your call to get cases out. Believe me, I think if you talk to any of my staff, they would be saying the same thing as you are. So we're hopeful that we're getting close to the finish line on some of the cases. So we're hopeful that we will be getting some cases out shortly. But a lot of that is outside of our control in the region. But in terms of kind of going back to the original question, these are really tough problems. These problems go back generations and generations. And obviously, one way to address some of the problems is the filing of fair housing complaints. Those tend to be reactive to the case that's filed. But as you heard a little bit when Demetria was speaking, we hope to have the new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule in effect, and that's a more proactive measure that could be in the toolbox to address some of these problems as well.
Very good. Well, we are at time, so I don't know if you want to say thank you, but I will say thank you for allowing me to be the host, and thanks to all our great panelists and the great audience and the questions. We know that we have work to do, and we'll continue to fight that fight with the help of everyone in this room. So thank you for joining us.
And I just wanted to commend everyone for coming and commend Dr. Shelley and her whole team for putting your great determination and focus helped us really bring together this great event. So we should all give them a hand.
Take care.
Just thank you and keep fighting. Can we get a couple of photo shots?
Yes.
We're gonna have to get together. I mean, I don't know what's happening.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah.
My name is Sharon Miller, and I just wanted to say I'm so grateful for your work. And I am working with be one of those representatives. Yeah.
Sassy was in today.
Okay, the sale number. 312.
All right, I'm